Okay, it started. It has started.
Let me see.
Can you check?
On
Can
air.
you check on YouTube if it's
On air.
Is
On
it
air.
all? Okay. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Rafael. It's about to start the second day of presentations of the second NuLFA NuLFiC Colloquium for Logic and Philosophy of Mathematics. There are going to be three speakers today. The speakers are, the first speaker is Professor Gregory Landini. The second speaker is going to be Professor Bruno Betzen. And the third speaker is going to be Professor Rodrigo Sabadin. Well, the first speaker of the day is Professor Gregory Landini. Before we present the speakers, we introduce the speakers. There are going to be time for questions after each talk, okay? There are going to be 20 minutes for questions after each talk. And let me introduce Gregory Landini. Professor Gregory Landini is a professor at University of Iowa. His teaching and research interests are logic, philosophy of logic, philosophy of mathematics, and philosophy of language. The title of his talk is Frege's Logicism is antithetical to Whitehead-Russell Logicism, though both are no-class theories. Okay, Professor Landini, we are very, very glad to have you here with us. Feel free to start at any time you want. Let me just remove the other speakers.
Okay, and just bring up the slides, please.
Okay.
Very good. So in this presentation, I wanted to talk a bit about Frege's logicism as opposed to Russell's logicism. If you look out on the internet or in many articles, you'll find that most speak of Frege's logicism as having a much narrower scope than the Whitehead-Russell logicism. But what I want to say is that the two kinds of logicism, if you will, are really quite different and even antithetical to one another. This is sort of a new idea, but I think that hopefully we could change the history books on this matter. And once we change, we could start to think about the Whitehead-Russell logicism in a new way, so that Frege's logicism is not sort of taken as Manaf sort of would have put it, the paradigm of logicism. Whitehead-Russell logicism is really quite different in kind, and therefore it cannot be evaluated against the backdrop of Frege's conception of logicism. So let me just go to the next slide. But this slide was a lot of fun because this is the Flammarion picture. And so we have down here, we have Frege, and of course we have Cantor and Zermelo. And then here we have Whitehead and Russell, and they're sort of outside the dome of the Earth. We are peering out into a different kind of logicism entirely from the conception of Frege's logicism, but also from Cantor and Zermelo's way of thinking about mathematics. So one of my favorite books concerning Russell is the Mysticism and Logic book. It's very amusing if you have the dust jacket to the book, because the dust jacket blurb doesn't say very much about what's actually in the book. I won't take the time to read it to you, but it's really quite amusing to think of what is actually in the book and what the dust jacket says about the book. This came out in 1917, and Russell was a rather popular figure at the time. But what is in the book is very important, actually. And one of the papers in this book that I find to be really essential reading for Russell is a paper called Mathematics and the Metaphysicians. And it came out, or was originally produced very early in 1901. And this really sets the stage for what Russell was doing in his idea of logicism. And it's been largely lost. And so we're trying to recover it. So just to cut to the chase and to tell you really the orientation that I have here, I would say that the following are the distinctions that I'm trying to make. First, there was a revolution within mathematics. And by that, I mean that it was mathematicians doing this revolution against others in the field. So it's not the Whitehead-Russell logicism is not going to be something that comes fully outside of mathematics. It's coming from within in some ways. So the revolution within mathematics was that abstract particulars are not the subject matter of any branch of mathematics. Mathematics is about relational order. And in mathematics and the metaphysicians, Russell praises the non-Euclidean geometers, Weierstrass, Cantor, with a new focus on order, not quantity, in all the fields of math. Now, in opposition, Frege rejects the revolution in mathematics. Frege's revolutionary CP logic is what I like to call it, CP logic of functions, because it gives us comprehension principles for functions. In his Begriffsschrift and Grundgesetze, there is a CP logic that assures the existence of ever new functions in extension, and it is synthetic a priori. I like to tell it like it is. Let's not make up a new notion of analytic to try to explain it. Let's just be straightforward about it. It's synthetic because we have the existence of new functions, and it's a priori. We have access to these functions independently of any empirical investigation. So Frege's CP logic is about functions. And of course, for Frege, functions are unsaturated entities as opposed to objects. Russell adopts a CP logic of properties and relations in intension. And Russell's CP logic, therefore, is about relations. CP, remember, means comprehension principle logic. And that's impredicative comprehension. Now, Frege's logicism is that numbers, whether they be natural, signed, or rational, reals, complex, whatsoever, are logical objects. Logical, abstract particulars, we might say. While Whitehead-Russell logicism maintains that revolutionary mathematics and mathematicians are doing CP logic. That is, they're studying relational structures when they do mathematics. This combines the revolutionary new CP logic with the revolution within mathematics. CP logic, again, is synthetic a priori science, studying all the structure kinds given by properties and relations, independently of the contingencies of their exemplification. Simple types do not get in the way of revolutionary mathematics. Well, that's very important. So we recall that Frege had a hierarchy of levels of functions, and Whitehead and Russell will have simple types. And under a straightforwardly realist interpretation, there would be simple types of properties and relations in intension. So we can conclude from this background information that Frege's logicism was antithetical to Whitehead-Russell logicism. Frege's logicism, therefore, contrary to Manasarif and many others, is not the paradigm. We can no longer speak of the Whitehead-Russell logicism as having a wider scope than Frege's logicism. Wider because it incorporates the whole of mathematics. So a very interesting features of the revolution within mathematics as defended by Whitehead-Russell logicism is that Whitehead and Russell agree with Frege that the revolution with logic is CP logic, and they accept that the ancestral induction is the essence of the notion of natural number. Thereby, Whitehead-Russell name it, the inductive cardinals. Now, Frege's CP logic is about functions, as we said, of unsaturated extensional entities, while Whitehead-Russell logicism is about relations and intension. And Whitehead-Russell reject Frege's ontology of functions, employing many-one relations instead. Frege's CP logic embraces concepts, that is, functions whose values are logical objects, the true and the false. And Frege's CP logic is thereby committed to logical objects, namely the true and the false. So a question arises is whether Frege's CP logic is committed to numbers as logical objects. In other words, can we separate Frege's CP logic of functions from his commitment to numbers as objects, as logical objects? Do numbers have a different ontological status than the logical objects that are the true and the false? And indeed, do we have any access to numbers or access to the true and the false that's different, epistemic access here. All right, so let's take a look. The question is rarely asked, and one might ask, why is it rarely asked? Now, we need an error theory. I don't know if this is the correct error theory. However, we can note that many interpreters following Dummett hold that Frege arrived at his theory that numbers are objects from a philosophical analysis of language illustrated in the Grundlagen. But I hold that this interpretation is mistaken. Frege offers a discussion in the Grundlagen of the history of failed attempts to build a theory of numbers as objects. There's no adjectival notion of number discussed in the Grundlagen. Okay, that's a controversial claim right there. We may have a chance to talk about that in the questions if we have anybody in the audience who thinks there's a notion of adjectival number. The point of saying this is that Frege's orientation in this work, the Grundlagen, is to say that, to take a look at attempts to make numbers as objects and see all the failed attempts, and then himself to offer a theory of numbers as objects. There was never any doubt that numbers are to be objects. And he's not deriving the view that numbers are objects from an analysis of natural language or of any language, even a formal language of math. So these are a couple of passages here, and sorry about my scribble. I scribbled right in the book along the margin here, because some people interpret these passages as if they were indicating a view of numbers as logical objects. And what I'm saying is that they certainly don't. He says it's attempting to define zero by saying that the number zero belongs to a concept if no object falls under it. So here we have a belongs to, and I like to put the z below it because we want to keep our predicate, our function sign in a function position. But see, notice that we have zero here occurring as object. So these kinds of locutions do not in any way suggest that Frege has an adjectival notion of number in mind. That's the only point of this slide. Dummett is mistaken, and the followers are mistaken when they argue that in reading Frege's Grundlagen, Frege arrived at the thesis that numbers are logical objects via an analysis of natural language numeric statements. How did he arrive at it? That's an interesting question. Did Frege think that the CP logical existence of concepts requires that numbers be logical objects? And here's my shocking, not a thesis quite, but a shocking proposal. Maybe the answer is yes. Maybe Frege maintains that he cannot separate his CP logic from his general theory, or at least some general theory, of numbers as logical objects, because we have no special access to the true and the false any more than we have access to numbers as objects. They're on a par. So now in mathematics, there's often characteristic functions used. For example, is the function prime. And so a number is prime. This function will carry a prime number to 0, and it will carry every other number to 1. There are many characteristic functions, and their values are typically 0 and 1. Frege's concepts are, after all, characteristic functions. So it would not be surprising if the true were allowed to be, say, 0, and the false, say, 1. The epistemic question of whether Frege held that we have epistemic access to the functions that are concepts by having special access to the logical objects, the true and the false, that's the question before us. And I find nothing in Frege's work to suggest this. He seems to hold that we have no better access here than we have for any logical objects. Now, there's a wonderful passage in a letter to Russell, and this is a 28th of July, 1902 letter, in which Frege talks about our access to logical objects, and he talks about it as only through a function that does correlation. At least that's how I read the letter. So let's read the letter together here. It says, I myself was long reluctant to recognize ranges of values, but I saw no other possibility of placing arithmetic on a logical foundation. But the question is, how do we apprehend logical objects? And I have found no other answer to it than this. We apprehend them as extensions of concepts, or more generally, as ranges of values of functions. I've always been aware that there are difficulties connected with this, and your discovery of the contradiction has added to them. But what other way is there? So I take this passage to make it clear enough that there is no special access to the logical objects that are the true and the false, and thus there's no special access to the functions that are concepts over and above functions generally. Hence, they're both on a metaphysical and epistemic par. So if our access to logical objects is solely via the second level function, value range function, which once we see that the basic law 5a is about, it just assures the extensionality involved, but also basic law 5b is what brings in the value range. The problem with 5b governing this non-homogeneous second level function is that it violates Cantor's power result. In other words, its converse would give us a function from objects onto functions, and that's ruled out by Cantor. So 5b is really the culprit, and in Frege's appendix, he really points that out. 5a is innocuous because all it's doing is extensionality. So you can't get any problems from 5a. It's expected anyway. The whole culprit comes from 5b. 5a is unimpeachable since it's merely a consequence of the extensionality of functions. So down below here, I give you a statement of 5a, and then the general extensionality, where the mx, fx is just indicating a second level function. And so we are expecting 5a. It's all about 5b. 5b is incompatible with Cantor's power theorem. And so it's 5b alone that makes the system contradictory. I wanted to note that some people think that there's a problem of referentiality going on here, but I don't think that that's the problem. The function sign for the non-homogeneous second level function for value ranges, it does refer, but it just does not refer to a one-one function. Cantor's power result, as applied to non-homogeneous cases, demands that there can be no function from objects onto concepts of those objects. The converse of this value range function would be in violation of Cantor's result. Frege doesn't really have a notation for the converse, and that may well be the cause of his missing this feature. But similarly, the inconsistency of the Grundgesetze shows that Frege's function sign, the horizontal, does not denote a function. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't denote at all. So in this slide, I try to indicate this idea of the value range function violating Cantor because its converse is assured to be a function by 5b. I just give this notation with an r with a little subscripted z below it to indicate the nature of the function that we're dealing with here and what it would mean to say that that function is converse is itself a function. And so many of you can read this notation already, but here we have A, where A is the value range, and they're identified, then they give you the same objects for the same values. And so it's this that's violating Cantor's power theorem. That's the source of the, as Dummett puts it, the serpent in the garden. That brought it down. So it's not really so much Russell's concern about the class of all classes not members of themselves. It's rather the problem in Frege is the violation of Cantor. And Russell's paradox, as formulated for the work, is just itself a manifestation of that violation of Cantor. It might be worth noting that Russell found his paradox, the class of all classes not member of themselves, by working on Cantor's power theorem as applied to the universal class. Now, it requires both the innocuous 5a and the erroneous 5b to arrive at Frege's fundamental theorem. It also requires identity and not a biconditional, since the horizontal fx is not always the same as fx For example, horizontal x squared is not x squared. Thus, it requires the basic law 4. And this is a very important point I'd like to point out, was given to me originally by Alessandro Duarte. And it's just really so very important in trying to understand what's actually going on with Frege. Unfortunately, it's completely missed in most of the literature on Frege's work, especially in the neologicist literature. Completely lost. But putting it together, we get a fundamental correlation theorem. And so here I just write down what basic law 4 is. And then on the right here, I have the idea that basic law 4 assures the conditions under which an identity can be swapped with a biconditional. So the replacement for 5b was 5b star. It looks like this. He also, very strangely, also wants to replace 5a with 5a star. 5a star is an unmitigated disaster for the work. And but he needed it to assure that he could get the theorem that nothing is a member of itself. And but it's an independent disaster. And so it kind of clouds our understanding of the source of the paradox. Being Cantor's power result, because 5a already has its own difficulties, 5a star, I mean. So 5a star implies the innocuous 5a, but 5a star has its own difficulties that need to be worked out. Okay, so we have no special access to the logical objects, the true and the false. And Frege's value range function is a non-homogeneous function from functions to value ranges as logical objects. This alone is our means of access to logical objects. And I think that that includes the true and the false. So Frege's CP logical functions must embrace concepts, and hence it must embrace some or other theory of value ranges. But of course, not 5b. Frege requires that one not over-determine what logical objects there are. And this requires him to leave it open that the true might be 0 and the false might be, say, 1, as is common with characteristic functions. Now, I wrote a paper on this topic called Stipulations, Missing Axioms in Frege's Grundgesetze der Arithmetik. And the idea is that Frege makes rather many stipulations that never become axioms in the work. And the question is, why not? And my answer is that it's because these, if you were to add these as axioms, they would be over-determining what logical objects they are, and where we ought not to over-determine. And indeed, Frege, even though he mentions that we could prove this result about 2, so we have turnstile negation sign 2, but curiously, there's no accommodating axioms that enable such a proof. And so it's interesting to think about what axioms might be added to the work in order to arrive at a proof like that. But when we think about such axioms, we have to be very careful about not over-determining our understanding of what logical objects there are. Now, the notion of over-determination is a little bit tricky because we wonder how we can decide whether something is or is not an over-determination. So I have some various examples of what are and what are not over-determinations. And by thinking through these things, I came up with an axiom that I called A, and A star, or A plus, which I think Frege intended in the work, but which did not make it to the axioms, but which nonetheless is not an over-determination, while other possibilities are. Subsequently, I discovered that there are a lot of logical equivalents to my A. So A, as you can see here, is probably the most elegant version of it, but A plus is a much more practical version. These are all provable equivalents. Then later, in further work on this topic, I found A star, and then most recently, double A. And double A is probably the most shocking of the group, even though it's logically equivalent to the rest, because double A actually enables basic law 4 to be a theorem. And that's what I discovered just this morning in going over these slides. And it sort of shocked me a bit and makes me feel very uneasy about things. So in future work, I may work more on that consequence and see that maybe maybe there's something a little bit over-determining about A after all, even though, as we'll see, it looks like there's texts which suggest that Frege held A. In any case, there is the question of whether A is independent of the other axioms. And so if I'm right, A implies 4, and since 4 is an axiom, there is a connectedness. I have no hope that it would go in the other direction. I don't think 4 implies A, or 4 together with the other axioms imply A. But A does seem to imply 4. And that's a new result. Note that from A as an axiom, together with the amalgamation of horizontals, basic law 4 and the innocuous 5A, we get various theorems. And here's a list of theorems. And because Frege makes suggestions about these being theorems, it's a reason for thinking that he thought A was true. Now, the last theorem that I have on my list here is perplexed Robert May, who also does a lot of very interesting and important work on Frege, but he calls it a quasi-paradox, and in his paper, The Role of Truth. But I find nothing perplexing, although it's a theorem that, of course, you can't have every z being such that it's equal to z equals z. Quite obviously, the true and the false are not going to satisfy this. But the point is that A is what yields these theorems, and that because Frege suggests there are such theorems, it suggests that he, tacitly at least assumed A. It seemed, therefore, to me that A can be shown to be not an overdetermining axiom. But notice that if I identify the true with its own singleton, then that is overdetermining. And Frege never actually adds axioms identifying the true with its own singleton. B is overdetermining axiom as well. But if you put A and B together, we could finally arrive at our proof that turnstile negation 2. In other words, 2 is not the true. But I find that B is an overdetermining axiom. B is nowhere suggested in Frege's commentaries, and so it's I would say is certainly overdetermining. But note that it would be an overdetermination, I think, to adopt an axiom P, which says that no value range is equal to the horizontal of that value range. In other words, no value range is equal to the true. And axiom P would assure that neither the true nor the false are value ranges. That is, they're not in the range of the correlation function for any function. But it would just be an overdetermination. So I don't see any easy way, and certainly no easy way, for Frege to separate his CP logic from his demand that there be logical objects. And once we have this demand, together with not wanting to have overdetermination, there's nothing in the way of maintaining that the true is 0 and the false is 1 or some such determinations. Frege seems to allow it. It's ontologically circular because, of course, 1 is correlated with a concept, a numerical concept, and so are the other numbers. But this kind of ontological circularity seems to be entirely innocuous. Okay, so we have a characterization of Frege, and his orientation is essentially to logical objects, even in the characterization of his CP logic. And that's the idea there. And this might explain why Frege never retreated from his value range story to just the CP logic alone, because it wasn't possible for him to do such a retreat. When we think about Whitehead-Russell logicism, we can imagine Principia's simple type theory as a kind of a variant of Frege hierarchy of levels of functions, although we don't have functions, we just have many-one relations. But we can think of it in a similar way, but Whitehead-Russell logicism is in a way a retreat, noticing what happens with Cantorian diagonal arguments, and with a very careful attention on Cantor, retreats to properties and relations in intension and rejects numbers as objects altogether. So Frege cannot retreat, as where, in a way, Whitehead-Russell logicism is a retreat. Whitehead-Russell logicism defends revolutionary mathematics in saying that mathematicians are doing CP logic. That is, they're studying properties and relations when they do mathematics. It's antithetical to Frege's logicism, which demanded numbers be objects and relies on concepts. Whitehead and Russell embraced the revolution within mathematics. By 1904, Russell had found that all the naive notions of a class fall to contradictions. And notice that a naive notion of a class is based on a primitive membership idea. Frege had no such notion. Frege's value ranges are not classes. Otherwise, we would have an access to the notion of a logical object, namely a value range, independently of correlation. And that's a mistake that I think is really sweeping in the literature. People think in some ways in terms of extensions or classes or something like that for Frege. And in fact, he's thinking in terms of correlation. There's no notion of a class going on in Frege. And we can understand that when we have a notion of a class, it derives from axioms governing a primitive relation of membership. So there are actually three various ways of doing naive notion of a class. These are the three: naive, naive plus, and naive minus. All three fall to paradox, but the Russell style paradox, where phi x is not a member of itself, only indicts the first. The other two are indicted by a different case of phi x, and this is something that Russell himself worked out. Russell discovered it in 1904. So Russell is responsible for showing that all three of these kinds of notions fail. And Russell alone is responsible for that. So it's not really the Russell paradox itself that does this. It's a much more deeper analysis that Russell gave to show that all notions of naive notions of a class are going to fail. Now, you may know that in some cases, Zermelo has been cited as someone who had bumped into a Russell-style paradox, and that Cantor had understood that there might be some kind of a Russell-style paradox. But we cannot attribute the discovery that the naive notion of a class fails to Zermelo or to Cantor, because, in fact, at best, they only indict naive. They don't talk about naive plus and naive minus. Russell also proved the following theorem. This is a famous 1905 theorem of Russell, and it's trying to tell us, use the ideas behind the Burali-Forti paradox to try to diagnose the source of paradox. Ultimately, Russell gave up this theorem as a diagnostic tool because it couldn't tell us when there's no class. That's what the conclusion here is. Well, not the conclusion, but the consequence. It couldn't tell us whether to decide there's no such class at all, or to decide whether, in fact, the function involved, the 1-1 function f, doesn't yield a value. In other words, there's no value for u. So the hope of using this theorem, which, by the way, is meant to be independent of any theory of classes, it's supposed to be a regulative principle to determine what classes there might be, it becomes not able to diagnose the good, the bad, and the ugly. So to decide when we have a class and when we do not. So Russell moved away from it finally and adopted a simple type theoretical approach to the structures that are involved. Of course, he wanted to emulate this simple type structures in his substitutional theory, but we needed to go into that emulation, which was abandoned by 1908. Okay, so to do a little bit of a summary, Frege's logicism. Numbers are logical abstract particulars. He can't separate his notion of a concept, and therefore his CP logic, from some or other notion of theory of logical abstract particulars, which comes from correlation. Whitehead-Russell logicism Revolutionary mathematics consists in the CP logical study of relations and properties in intension, and it's independent of any contingencies of their exemplification. Russell's connection to the revolution within mathematics against abstract particulars has been almost completely missed in the literature. Now, and amusingly, Russell complained that Principia Mathematica had not been read. And he writes, Whitehead and I were disappointed that PM was only viewed from a philosophical standpoint. People were interested in what was said about the contradictions and in questions of whether ordinary mathematics had been validly deduced from purely logical premises. I used to know only 6 people who had read the later parts of the book. 3 of these were Poles, subsequently, I believe, liquidated by Hitler. The other 3 were Texans, subsequently successfully assimilated. That 3 Texans were assimilated might mean to say that they got converted to Zermelo set theory. Still, the comment seems quite hyperbolic, since it indicts the likes of Ramsey and Carnap, Church, Quine, and even Gödel himself. There's a wonderful website on this trying to find out who the 3 were that I've indicated below if somebody wants to follow out that. So it seems very hyperbolic. But is it hyperbole? No interpreters of PM noticed the following. Hume's principle for cardinals and ordinals has false instances due to Cantor's diagonal power argument applied to non-homogeneous similarity and ordinal similarity. We do get the homogeneous Hume's principle at star 103.14. The little 0 down below means homogeneous. So the members of alpha are the same simple type as the members of beta. And this is the homogeneous cardinal of alpha equals the homogeneous cardinal of beta. But we find explicitly star 101321. Note that the cardinal number of alpha equals the cardinal number of beta, horseshoe, alpha similar beta, is not always true. If the homogeneous cardinal of alpha and if the cardinal number of alpha and the cardinal number of beta are descending, we may have that they're both empty without having alpha similar to beta. And the idea there is Cantor has shown that if you're in a lower type, there's nothing. There's no way to get a similarity relation or equinumerosity relation between entities of the lower type and all the entities of the next type up, because the next type up will be like the power class. And so the empty class is both a descending cardinal, but it's also a descending relation number. And we find this in PM Volume 2, page 321. By the way, if anybody wants me to send them these slides, let me know so you can, have a chance to look up some of these things in Principia yourself. If in a certain type, the relation number of P and the relation number of Q are both null, we have that in that type that the relation number of P is equal to the relation number of Q. They're both empty, but we need not have P as ordinally similar to Q, isomorphic to Q. So Hume's principle has false instances in descending relations of similarity. And that has an analog in Frege's work as well, because Frege has all these hierarchy of functions. And Frege has to accept non-homogeneous functions of equinumerosity because he has to accept non-homogeneous functions in general. In fact, his value range function is itself a non-homogeneous function. But unfortunately, this is ignored by the neo-logicists who really have abandoned Frege's levels of functions altogether. So for that reason alone, neo-logicism is really not Fregean in any significant sense. Frege's Grundgesetze, basic law 5b, governing value ranges, hope to assure that the non-homogeneous equinumerosity does no harm. But as we saw, 5b violates non-homogeneous variant of Cantor's power result. And Frege knew it. In his appendix on the contradiction, he pretty much points that out. So interpreters didn't notice that Principia has these various theorems. These are the theorems that show that the cardinal number of whose members are of the type alpha, relative type alpha, and here this is the universal class whose members are of the relative type alpha, is empty because of Cantor. And this is the same result or similar result for relation numbers. And here I made a mistake. This should be an R because this is the relation number of P. And this is the relation that's a universal relation because it's I, identity, with its domain restricted to the relative type of things that are equal to or not equal to the campus of P. So this relation is the relata of this relation are of higher type than the members of the cardinal number itself. So it's empty. Nobody seems to have noticed this. Nobody. It's very strange. Even Peano, in his review of Principia, we find that he missed the point. And hence we know that he didn't read Principia, or at least he didn't read it carefully. This came out recently in the Russell Journal, Journal of the Bertrand Russell Archives. And he even attributes it to Principia's volume 1, but of course the notion of the cardinal number is only in volume 2, not volume 1. But in any case, he says if alpha and beta are classes, then the cardinal number of alpha equals the cardinal number of beta. If and only if there is the 1-1 correspondence between the members of alpha and beta. And this is mistaken. Star 73 deals with the relation of similarity, and it's explicitly noted that it is relative type ambiguous, and there is descending versus homogeneous variance. The relative type ambiguous notion of the cardinal number is not introduced until volume 2, where, as we saw, the above is shown to be false. And note well that in star 73.37, the horseshoe only goes in one direction. Alpha is similar to beta, then whatever is similar to alpha, if and only if it's similar to beta. It doesn't go in both, and it's conspicuous by its absence that it doesn't go in both directions. So let's fact check Quine. Classes are said to have the same cardinal number, just in case they are respectively the domain and the converse domain of a one-to-one relation. Well, we just saw that that's false. Quine, of all people, Quine studied with Whitehead and wrote his dissertation on the Principia. And here he's maintaining this holds at the Principia. Maybe what he meant to say is this ought to have held in Principia, but that too would be false. It's not the case that it ought to have held. Principia is embracing simple types, and it's embracing Cantorian diagonal results. And that is to embrace that Hume's principle has false instances in descending cardinals. Here's another quote from Quine. The first infinite cardinal, an Aleph null, is defined as the cardinal number of the class of all finite cardinals. That's false. In truth, Aleph null is defined in terms of the domain of a relation E, a relation in extension that has the property of being a progression. The domain of any such relation that has the property is both Frege and Dedekind infinite. And here's the star number, 123.01, makes it quite clear that Aleph null is defined in terms of the domain of some or other relation that's a progression. And this is very important because it's a feature of the revolutionary mathematics. It's not a feature of some failure in Principia to capture infinity, because the point is that the notion of a cardinal number, the notion of finite cardinal or an inductive cardinal does not contain within itself the notion of infinity. That has to be abandoned. Frege thought it does, because Frege thought he could prove the infinity from the ancestral relation, together with his view that numbers are objects. But in fact, in Principia, that has been shown not to be the case. The notion of an inductive cardinal, there's nothing part of that notion, which comes from the ancestral, that contains within it the notion of infinity. So the Dedekind postulates don't make sense anymore. That would assure infinity. It's not part of the notion of number. That's independent of whether you could prove that there are infinitely many natural numbers. It's a result of the revolution within mathematics. So I say this is an important new result within revolutionary mathematics itself, namely that, contrary to Cantor, smallest Dedekind infinite class does not require for its articulation the view that the natural numbers are the paradigm of a smallest Dedekind infinite class. the notion of Dedekind infinity is not part of the notion of natural number once we accept that the notion of natural number comes from the ancestral. And it's everywhere in the literature on this topic. And so we can contrast in particular Boulos, who wants to make such a big deal about it that he calls it the benefits of theft over honest toil. So he's trying to indict Russell for making the very mistake he attributes Dedekind, among others, to make, namely postulating things when in fact we have to have the honest toil of constructing them. So Whitehead and Russell agree with Frege that the notion of natural number derives from the ancestral and CP logic comprehension, which yields induction. And that's why infinity is not part of the notion of an inductive cardinal. And that's why Piano 4 loses its authority to guide the revolutionary mathematics of natural number. Again, let me emphasize, this is independent of whether you could prove that there are infinitely many natural numbers from the CP logic. Another error of Quine, or false report about Principia from Quine, is that Whitehead and Russell found that they had to avoid the Burali Forti, they had to restore simple types. And that's false because Quine conflates simple type expressions from relative type expressions that are found from 63 to 65, which vanish with the no classes and no relations theories. So one must never conflate simple type with relative type. Quine conflates them because Quine wants to imagine Principia is a theory of classes that come with simple types of classes. And that's exactly what it is not. There are no classes in Principia. So we're getting very near the end here because we want to make sure we leave time for questions. So let me just say a couple of quick things. And that is that I'm looking for new axioms. Once we separate simple types from relative types, we can investigate the possibility of new axioms and the possibility of new interpretations. One thing that we note is that monism is not regarded as logically possible in Principia, and that's very important, and that the multiplicative axiom and the axiom of infinity, so-called, are on a epistemological and metaphysical par. There are plenty of passages that show that in Principia, and so we need an entire reset of Principia. I call it Principia Mathematica Redux. Let's return to the work, find out what's actually in it, instead of being misled by the many famous interpreters of it. So let me just show you quickly my possibility of new axioms. One is the sim-ax, which says that for any class, there is a class. So this is a class of individuals of type T, and it's similar to a class of individuals of the next type up. This is not a class of classes, it's a class of individuals. So we're separating the notion of simple type of individual from the notion of a class. There are no classes. And this other axiom here is very interesting to me. I call it star 105, which is trying to tell us that we can, if by adding an axiom governing relations between classes of individuals of one type and classes of individuals of another, of a higher, we might be able to get motivation for an axiom that would yield the infinity of simple type entities in higher types than in the lowest. The lowest then might be finite and the higher infinite. And this is something that Whitehead himself was searching for in the Principia. So he even mentions it at the outset of Principia. And I thought I had that passage where he gives you the quote of that, but I must have passed over it too quickly here. Hang on, let me see if I can find it somewhere. Quine misses this entirely, but the point is that according to Principia, we have to realize that a simple type can be such that it's finite and the next one above it is actually infinite. And of course, once you get infinity, you'll have infinity all the way up. Anyway, let me end with that because that's a lot to digest already. And again, the conclusion is that I reach is that Frege, his logicism, cannot separate concepts from the CP logic, So he's committed to some form of correlation, and therefore some form of the view that numbers and the true and the false are all on a par as logical objects. As where Principia can separate these two entirely, we can have a CP logic not committed to numbers as objects, not committed to any abstract particular objects, and develop mathematics in this way. And as a result, they have they're antithetical to one another, these two forms of logicism. Okay, thanks very much. We can...
Thank you very well. Thank you very much, Professor Landini. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. I forgot to mention earlier that we have an attendance list for the participants. So if you want a certificate, you can register your name on this list. Now we have 20 minutes for debate. Let me check if there are questions in the chat. Okay, so we have Professor Rodrigo has a question. Let me start. Let me start with Rodrigo.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Gary, thank you very much for this presentation. A lot of points to discuss. As you know, I think on Principia we are very much on the same page about a lot of the points, especially the matter of Principia having no conception of cardinal numbers as objects, which is it's impressive how much this point is lost in the literature on the subject. But you mentioned that which is in part a good paper of Bulus, but he misses this point entirely in his discussion of the matter, and so the accusation of succumbing to the temptations of theft over honest oil is completely lost, precisely because it does not notice this crucial point about the work. But I have a question actually about something you say about the Grundlagen. You say that there is no adjectival notion of number in the foundations of arithmetic, right? I think that's sort of controversial, but what I wanted to point out is that I think what cannot be denied is that in later works, such as Frege's posthumous writings, Frege does explicitly consider an adjectival concept of number, but of course he abandons that because, as he says, we cannot as I read those passages, at least, that the adjectival notion of number as higher order concepts or cardinality concepts, it does not allow us to explain the linguistic use of numbers as singular terms. So the point I would like to hear you talk more about is precisely that, because I see in Frege the idea that somehow he was led to a conception of numbers as objects in virtue of some theses about or some views about the analysis of natural language. I'm trying to put a paper about this together. The provisory title is the miracle of number, which is a phrase that appears in some of Frege's posthumous notes, where he puts forward precisely that where does numbers as objects come from? And I see that he arrives at this idea that there must be numbers as objects through some views about the analysis of natural language. So I would like to hear more about this point, if you can. Thank you very much again for the presentation.
Well, I think you're Rodrigo. Thanks for your question. I think you're very right that there's a wide sweeping literature that wants Frege to arrive at the notion of number as object from an analysis of language. I'd love if you could, we could correspond a bit about this in the future. Send me some passages and so on, and we can get dates because, dates are very important. Pre-paradox, post-paradox, that kind of thing. And then maybe passages from Grundlagen itself, that are maybe might be interpreted as a kind of a discussion of either of an adjectival approach or as deriving the notion of a number as an object from something linguistic. Now, as you well know, Frege early on has his context principle. There's a controversy about whether the context principle continues into the Grundgesetze or is completely dropped, and what role this context principle was playing. Of course, in my view, the context principle concerns appreciating the nature of a function as an unsaturated entity. So let's not read natural language in such a way as we do not appreciate that functions are essentially unsaturated. And of course, the unsaturatedness of the function preserves completely into the Grundgesetze. So in a way, the concern is about natural language. We need the context principle to safely navigate through natural languages, because natural languages are going to violate this kind of concern, discovery, if you will, that functions are unsaturated. We don't need to talk about the context principle in the formal language because we already made the formalisms assure that functions unsaturated nature is represented in the ideography. So you don't need to discuss a context principle unless you're applying your logic to a natural language situation. But now, to answer your question a little better, once we have the context principle before us, we realize that there's not going to be anything straightforwardly in natural language that could help us discover that numbers are objects, because we don't trust natural language anyway because of the context principle. We have to be very careful about the issue of the unsaturatedness of functions. So I just don't see any motivation Frege could have to try to derive the notion of number as an object from natural language. Instead, he's already decided that numbers must be logical objects because he's a metaphysician of mathematics, and he thinks that in geometry there must be abstract particular spatial entities, and he thinks that in mathematics of the number there must be these objects. We count the numbers. We are able to prove the infinity of the numbers, all because numbers are objects. So I think these are his motivations, not something about natural language. But at the same time, we got to look at passages and see what kinds of arguments he might give. And we have to respect the fact that since he is attempting to talk to a wide audience in some of his work, he might not himself very carefully reflect his own views. This happens a lot when we try to reach a wider audience and we get a misimpression. That's why it's not just in Principia that I advocate reading the actual Principia, not the commentaries and introductions. I say the same thing about Frege. Let's read the actual Grundgesetze and not get lost in commentaries on it, even if they're Frege's own commentaries, because the actual formal work speaks loudly enough as to what's going on. So that's not a very perfect answer to your question, but it certainly it gives you the approach that I'm trying to take here. Dummett was very influential in thinking that Frege is the, sort of a turn, the linguistic turn, as he calls it, or return to natural language. But I think it's really had a dark side, if you will. It's causing us to misunderstand Frege. And one of the easiest and most important problems is people translate Frege's work into a modern predicate language, which garbles it entirely. We have to appreciate the functional orientation that Frege has. And when we do, I think we get some interesting new results, like some of the ones that I've been trying to put forward, like axiom A and the stipulations without axioms and so forth that are involved in Frege's work.
Thank you very much. I don't know if I
Okay, we have further questions in the chat. The second question is, regarding the referentiality of the epsilon function, in Frege's first letter to Russell, he says that the contradiction does not guarantee the reference of expressions for course of values. How would you interpret this passage, Professor?
So a lot of people have reacted to that letter where Frege, in the face of the contradiction, suggests that something is wrong with his argument from referentiality. And some, Sluga, have even gone so far to say is that if there was a proof of referentiality, there would be a proof of consistency. Because if we have a function expression referring to a function, then indeed that there couldn't be a contradiction, because a contradiction requires a function sign to refer to something that's not a function, because it would have two values, the true and the false. So Sluga goes so far even as to say that the proof of referentiality yields a proof of consistency. And so therefore, since there's a contradiction, it's not consistent, the proof of referentiality fails. I think this is entirely mistaken, because what Frege is trying to say in that passage is that, in fact, there's something wrong with his proof of referentiality. That's for sure. But it's not connected intimately with the contradiction in the way people think, because the idea is that a function sign, whether a function sign refers to a function, is driven by what axioms you have, not by your intention. It's not by an intention to use a function sign in a certain way. You have to have axioms that determine what that function sign refers to, and whether indeed it refers to a function is dependent upon the axioms that you have. So there is something wrong with his notion that his value range function refers to a 1-1 function. It's not to say that it doesn't refer. So if we had an expression for its converse, that expression would not denote a function. So you might ask the question, well, what then does it denote? Well, again, the axioms determine what you have referred to, not your intention. And so that's what's one of the important things that's wrong with his proof of referentiality.
Okay. They also wants to ask something. The question is, what would be the status of the famous null class in Frege's null class theory? And he has a further comment on that. Assuming it as the concept under which no object falls, wouldn't this be akin to assuming a sort of purely logical entity?
Well, we have to be very careful about the word entity. Frege has two sorts of entities. There are objects, and then there are functions. Functions are called entities as well, but they're essentially unsaturated. So you can have the essentially unsaturated function of non-self identity, but that doesn't give you an object of any sort. By correlation, you could correlate that notion with an object, and you understand the object it's correlated with via the correlation function. But it's only via a correlation function that we get objects, and that Frege even says it's via that correlation function that we understand logical objects. And my controversial claim is that that's how we understand the true and the false as well. In other words, we have no special access to concepts independently of functions. So we must be able to correlate to get concepts on the table in the first place, because their values are logical objects. So in short, once again, we have the concept, or if you like, the function non-self-identity. That's all well and good, but nothing there gives us a logical object unless and until we can correlate that with an object.
Okay, thank you, Professor. I also have a question, if I may. You mentioned when you mentioned Dummett in your presentation, you said that his view that, as I understood it, his view that Frege's conclusion that numbers are objects has nothing to do with natural language or the way Frege views natural language. I want to make an observation on this topic because in Grundlagen we see in some passage, I mean the passage in which Frege talks about the definite article in natural language. And Frege says that the way we use the definite article in natural language indicates that the thing we are talking about is an object. And in other words, the use of the definite article presupposes that we are talking about an object and a single object. So what's the point of this observation if natural language has nothing to do with Frege's conclusion that numbers are objects?
Well, thanks for your question. Once again, I would say that we have to be very careful about Frege's use of his context principle. Natural language suggests that functions are objects too. As, for example, we say the concept horse is not a concept. And he replies, Benno Carey, scathing criticism by asking for a pinch of salt, for example, and using his context principle. So because of that, I have no confidence whatsoever that Frege thinks that he has a knockdown argument in favor of numbers as objects from natural language. Natural language is going to be as misleading as anything ever could be. What he's trying to do in the Grundlagen is explain his account of numbers as objects, and he's trying to look at other accounts or attempts to account for numbers as objects and show that they're failures. That's how I see the Grundlagen. It's not trying to derive a notion of numbers as objects from natural language. But as I said to Rodrigo, let's look at passages and see what we think. This is happily, there's a kind of somewhat empirical matter here. There are passages. I would like to say that the passages, at least in Grundlagen, are ones that are failed attempts to make numbers objects, not adjectival. So in fact, the Caesar problem, for example, is not an issue concerning an objection to adjectival number. Remember, adjectival numeric concepts are perfectly good for Frege. In fact, those are going to be interpreted in terms of functions, numeric functions of second level. But that they don't give us numbers as objects. We need a correlation theory or a notion of extension or something like that to get our numbers as objects. So it's perfectly legitimate to have adjectival, as it were, or numeric concepts of number. They come first, but that's not the whole story because he's already committed to the view that numbers are objects. And it can't be the whole story. That's the puzzling thing that I'm trying to work on lately, because Frege cannot separate his CP logic from some theory of correlation, because the very existence of concepts depends upon logical objects. And that's the idea, as where Russell can, because he's not oriented to functions and concepts in the first place. He's oriented to properties and relations and intention.
Okay, thank you, Professor. I have a second question concerning Frege's stipulations in Grundgesetze. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you said that the stipulations that Frege made in paragraph 10 of Grundgesetze, we should not see them as over-determining the notion of truth value. How should we see this stipulation? What's the formal role of these stipulations in Grundlagen if they do not over-determine the notion of truth value?
Well, the idea there are different things going on there. One thing going on is the idea or the entertainment of a stipulation that the true is equal to its singleton, if we can speak that way. But he never makes that stipulation. He never makes it into an axiom that the true is supposed to be identified with its singleton. What he's talking about there is that it's not impossible to do so. He doesn't do so, but it's not ruled out by the other aspects of the theory. Now, the fact that it's not ruled out strongly suggests that he holds axiom as if it were an axiom. My what I call A, or if you prefer, A plus. And that's very important to me, because then it suggests that the viability of a possible axiom, though it would be over-determining, that would assign the true to its singleton, is made possible because he holds A. So A is not itself an over-determination, because A does not yield that the true is equal to its singleton, but it makes it open and viable to make that stipulation into an axiom. But he doesn't do it. Why doesn't he do it? Answer: it's an over-determination. So that's how I see what's going on there. A is corroborated in some way in section 10, not because it yields the true is equal to its singleton, or not because he's suggesting that he will make it into an axiom, but that it makes it viable to do just that. But now, very recently, I think I have discovered that my axiom A, or it's better to work with A plus, yields basic law 4 as a theorem. So in other words, it's stronger than basic law 4. And that suggests to me that maybe he was nervous about A as well, and that's why we don't see A as an axiom straightforwardly. It also shows that there's not there while one might say A is independent of the axioms, in the sense that the axioms that are there do not yield A, doesn't follow that A wouldn't yield basic law 4, which is a new discovery. Makes me very nervous about the whole story of A. But nonetheless, it's very interesting to think of things in this way. Okay, so hopefully that's an answer to your question. Again, just to summarize, he never makes the stipulation that the true is equal to its own singleton. But what he does say indicates that he has in mind that A holds of the work, because my axiom A is what makes it viable to make such a, or makes it, not just viable, but makes it in some ways motivated to make that stipulation, which he doesn't make.
Okay, thank you, Professor. I actually have a last question concerning Grundgesetze. I think you mentioned that one of the differences between Frege's formal system and Grundgesetze and a class theory is that Frege's system does not have a membership relation properly. So, in Grundgesetze, Frege defines a relation, we can call it the cap relation or horseshoe relation. It's symbolized by the horseshoe symbol. So how should we see it? What's the difference between this relation and the membership relation? Because I always thought this relation is very similar to the membership relation we have in set theory or in class theory, for example.
Well, the similarity that you naturally see there comes from people translating Frege into a predicate logic. And of course, that translation is, in my opinion, not warranted and not correct. But more importantly, we can see that it's not what I would like to say is that if you have a theory of classes, that theory derives from intuitions of the membership relation. The membership relation there must be a primitive. And then you write down axioms governing what you think is involved in membership. Zermelo writes down radically different axioms than Quine, for example. And a naive theory would write down quite different axioms governing membership than Zermelo. But in all such cases where you have a theory of classes, the membership relation is the primitive. In Frege, his, what should we call it, little soft... he writes that little line anyway, little soft curve, is defined. And its definition is very importantly connected to basic law 5b. In other words, he gets his fundamental theorem of correlation. So X has this relation to the value range of F, if and only if Fx. He derives it by means of this definition. So because characterization in that way, a definition will introduce a new relationship for sure. It's not a primitive. It relies upon his intuitions of basic law 5b. And of course, the extensionality. And as Alessandro has pointed out, basic law 4. You need basic law 4 in there as well. Frege does speak in the Grundlagen about extensions, but at that time he did not have the full theory yet of correlation, and he wanted to rely upon his audience understanding something about the way mathematicians were using notions of extension or class. But he himself, in that work and later part, as I'm sure you know, he says that nothing here turns on a theory of extensions. And that's been a really puzzling comment. If in fact the whole house of cards in Grundlagen seems to turn on extension. I interpret it as saying that he's trying to explain his theory of correlation, and he's letting his audience at that time borrow that notion of extension to help them to see what he's up to. But what he's up to is not a theory of classes, as opposed to somebody who has a notion of extension. There's another way to look at this, if you let me, and that is when Frege has the double course of values, that theory of how to do a double course of values is outright impossible to hold as a theory of classes, because it relies upon the correlation giving you an object, not a class, to do the double course of values. So I would just suggest that you take a look at the double course of values, and you might then agree with me that it would be unintelligible if the value range were thought of as a class, even when the function is a concept. But I agree with you that this is widespread in the literature on Frege, and of course, I'm trying to change that.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Landini. Let's continue to the next speaker.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great fun to be here, and I look forward to the talks that are to come.
Okay, thank you for the patience. Okay, let's continue. The second speaker today is Professor Bruno Betzen. Bruno Betzen is an assistant professor in the School of Philosophy at Zhejiang University in China. I think it's pronounced this way. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, right, Zhejiang, yes.
His main research interests are in the philosophy of logic and mathematics, with special emphasis on the philosophical foundations of mathematical constructivism. His talk is entitled Bishop's Debt to Frege. Professor Betzen, welcome to our academic event. It's very nice of you to participate. Each speaker has up to 40 minutes of presentation. I will let you know when there are 5 minutes left. You may start.
Wonderful, thank you. How do I put my slides on? Oh, wonderful. Thank you. So first of all, thanks. I want to thank Rafael for the wonderful introduction, and also to Alessandro for the very kind invitation. I want to also mention that I was part of the first NuLFA NuLFiC colloquium for logic and philosophy of mathematics in 2020. Back then it was, during COVID, everything was online. And, I'm very happy to be also part of the second event 4 years later. So before I start, I want to mention something, because every time I give an online talk, especially when I'm in China, I feel a little bit anxious because of the connection. So if I am cutting out, or if you feel like my connection is unstable at some point, please interrupt me at any moment and let me know, and we'll see how we can proceed from there. All right. So when Alessandro invited me, I was thinking about what to talk about. Last time I talked about Frege's theory of types, and I wanted to somehow also honor this tradition and talk about Frege as well. Well, I will kind of have to switch gears a little bit here, because this talk, despite having Frege in the title, is mostly about constructive mathematics. So constructive mathematics is a version of mathematics that is done without the law of excluded middle. The law of excluded middle is that law according to which that says that given any proposition A, either A or not A holds. And constructive mathematics is, broadly speaking, mathematics without this law. All right, so there are many different versions of constructive mathematics, and the version that I want to discuss in this talk is Bishop's brand of constructivism. All right, more on that later. So my talk will have three main parts. First of all, I want to tell you exactly what I want to do here. Then we'll talk about Bishop's views on mathematical construction. And then I will develop these views of Bishop, borrowing some arguments from Frege, which is why Frege is in the title of the talk. So, as I said before, this talk is mainly about constructive mathematics. So constructive mathematics has its name because it is a distinctive form of mathematics, which is all about constructions. So what is a construction anyway? You can think of a construction in very broadly terms as the act of putting something together according to certain rules from parts. So there are many examples of constructions, in mathematics. So you may think of a geometric construction, using ruler compass, for example, or you can think of the construction of a set, right? Sometimes you'll see in textbooks all the time the construction of the real numbers, right? So these phrase is as another instance of how we use the word construction. We can also speak of the construction of a function. In category theory, we have a universal constructions, and the word construction is everywhere in mathematics. But in constructive mathematics, however, constructions, they have a very important, they play a very important role in this framework. Well, why? First of all, constructions are not used as acts in constructive mathematics, but as objects. So constructions, they are objectified acts, right? So we think of, for example, natural numbers as constructions, real numbers as constructions, and so on. So they are objects. So they are first-class objects of the theory, of a mathematical theory. And of course, this is unique to constructive mathematics. But the converse also holds. While all constructions are objects, we also have that all objects are constructions. All right? So there are no objects which cannot be constructed, which is, again, why this form of mathematics is known as constructive mathematics. Every construction has to be carried out according to some rules of construction. So at the end of the day, the notion of construction, it is dependent on that of a rule of construction. So depending on what kind of rules of construction you accept, you may say that something is a construction or not. For example, classical mathematicians will say that the construction of reals by means of Dedekind cuts is a construction, while constructive mathematicians will disagree because this is not constructive in the technical sense of constructive mathematics. All right? But unfortunately, things are not so simple, because even in constructive mathematics, there is disagreement concerning what a construction rule is. So there are many different varieties of constructive mathematics. I want to focus on 3, which are the main ones. All right. So Brouwer's intuitionism, then there's Russian recursive constructivism, and finally Bishop's. Okay. So they all differ in that the kind of rules of construction that each accepts is different. While Brouwer is going to say that not only effective rules may be admissible, but also free choices. So you can stipulate, for example, freely choose a certain object, and this may be allowed as a rule of construction. This means that according to Brouwer's intuitionism, the notion of constructibility, it goes beyond effective calculability. All right. So constructibility is to be identified with intuitability. Brouwer will refuse any sort of reduction of his mathematics to a formal system. All right. Markov, on the other hand, and his followers, they are going to accept Chur's thesis, and thus they're going to endorse a very formal, in a sense, approach to constructive rules, to rules of construction, according to which rules of constructions, they can be described in terms of a programming language, a fixed programming language, as, say, partial recursive functions. All right, in the sense of Chur's thesis. And these two, they historically used to be the main schools of constructivism. They were not very popular by the 60s. That was when Bishop, an American mathematician, came around and developed a new form of constructive mathematics, which, unlike these other two, is consistent with classical mathematics. And that's Bishop's brand of constructivism. The basic idea is that the rules of construction are going to be effective rules. So a rule of construction is simply just an effective rule. All right. And this was a very popular form of constructivism among mathematicians because, you know, you can be a constructivist while still doing a kind of mathematics that is understandable by your colleagues in the other departments, so to speak, right? So there can be communication between, you know, classical mathematicians and constructivists still, because this mathematics is consistent with classical. All right, so there's been a lot of literature on Brouwer already, on Brouwer's account of construction, which is why I do not want to delve into this. And also, the matter of what a construction rule of construction is in Markov's school is not up to debate because, well, there's given a very precise answer by, you know, Chur's thesis. On the other hand, there is very little work on Bishop's views of constructions, with the exception of Billinger, Krozilla, and myself in a very recent paper that appeared this year in Filosofia Mathematica. All right, so what is my aim in this talk? So I just want to shed light on Bishop's account of constructions, and I want to do this by borrowing arguments from Frege. To do this, however, we will have to take a look at some of Bishop's views, and we'll develop them using some sort of Fregean argument. All right, so the two aspects of Bishop's views that I want to emphasize here in this talk are computation, and open-endedness. So according to Bishop, constructions are different if they compute differently. So for example, say you have the construction 2 plus 2 and you have 4. They should be different constructions because they compute differently. 4 does not compute to anything, while 2 plus 2, it computes to, depending on how you define addition, it may compute to the successor of 2 plus 1, and so on. All right? And open-endedness has to do with the fact that the totality of constructions never forms a precisely delimited set or collection. It is always open-ended in that you may never rule out something from being a construction. Bishop, however, was primarily a mathematician, and although he wrote on philosophy sometimes, he wrote some philosophical works, that was not his primary goal. So we will have to develop these views. And like any form of development, there are going to be some things that are, of course, open to interpretation. All right, so before we take a look at Bishop's account of construction, it will be helpful to start with a very simple paradigm of construction, namely an integer. So what is an integer according to Bishop? Well, here is this his official definition, which it says it's dignified by the title of a fundamental constructivist thesis. Every integer can be converted in principle to decimal form by a finite, purely routine process. And of course, these process here has to be effective, right? So this seems to implicitly imply that integers with different representations, they have to be distinct, because every integer can be converted to decimal form. So if an integer is not already in decimal form, then it might not be the same. All right. There is actually a very subtle distinction in Bishop's work between equality and identity. Namely, equality is a very extensional account or notion. And according to Bishop, equality is a convention. So given any set, you may always define an equality relation for the element sets. And all it has to be, it's an equivalence relation, right? Equality is thus a ternary relation between two elements of a set and that set, and it is indispensable for doing mathematics. Now, on the other hand, identity is extremely intentional. It is sensitive to the ways that constructions compute. It is binary, meaning that the sets that two mathematical objects belong to is irrelevant. And it is dispensable for mathematics, which is why Bishop does not really talk much about it. All right. So here is I think it's a particularly illuminating quote from Bishop on how constructions may be computed differently. So let's read it together. Thus, there are many ways to compute. The most primitive way is to count digits one by one. A more sophisticated method is to use decimal notation. Using exponential notation, we can perform more sophisticated computations yet. Every constructive proof can be regarded as the development of a possibly new notation, and the verification that certain computations performed with the aid of that notation produce certain results. So this passage seems to suggest that the unary notation is the most primitive. So unlike the decimal system for representing integers, the unary one is more primitive. And by that, I mean, say, if we consider the only the positive integers, then we start with 1, and then we represent 2 as the successor of 1, 3 as the successor, and so on, right? That's a unary notation. Another thing that I believe this passage sheds light on is the fact that computations, they are performed by unfolding definitions. Nominal definitions. You define a certain notation in a way, and if you want to compute, well, you just unfold this notation. All right, now let's talk about open-endedness. What is a construction then, according to Bishop? And this is one of my favorite quotes from Bishop, and you can find it. You can find it in the appendix, the second appendix to the Foundations of Constructive Analysis. It goes like this: mathematics that has computational meaning may require the exercise of judgment before that meaning is discharged. Whether a given rule generates a constructively defined sequence of integers requires judgment. If the judgment is not unanimous, either the mathematics is bad or the judgment, or at least one of the judges, is bad. This is the difference between man and the presently available computers. We exercise judgment, and the computers do not. Okay? So, again, this is a very interesting quotation. Why? Well, because here Bishop is appealing to the fact that whether something is a rule, whether a putative rule is indeed a rule of construction, depends on our judgment. You see, this faculty that we have, and it seems to be a faculty that we all share as part of a mathematical community. All right, so this judgment has to be unanimous. So the notion of an effective rule is a primitive notion that we all have access to somehow. Bishop, of course, does not dive into the details on this. All right, so he's going to conclude that because the computer is lacking in judgment, the theorems of constructive mathematics do not, in general, represent computer programs. They represent person programs, which in some instances can be transformed into computer programs and in other instances cannot. In fact, like Brouwer, Bishop is very much against the formalization of mathematics. He has a very negative attitude toward formalization. So a construction, according to Bishop, is just a finite routine consisting of rules which have been unanimously judged as effective by some sort of ideal mathematician. And by that ideal mathematician, I mean, of course, a mathematician whose judgments are all shared by a whole community of mathematicians. Okay, so the central rule that is at play here is that of an effective rule. And Bishop is going to refuse to give a precise mathematical definition for this notion, because doing that would be futile, according to him. Okay, so, and this is part of his criticism of Markov's school of recursive constructivism. He's going to say that the recursive constructivists seem to be motivated by the desire to avoid such vague terms as rule and set. Their mathematics is forbiddenly involved and laborious, a great price to pay for the precision they hope to attain. My personal opinion is that they have not attained any additional precision. Perhaps any attempt to make the notion of rule more precise is futile. So the recursive constructivists, remember, they accept church thesis, meaning that they are going to give a precise mathematical definition for what a rule of construction is. But Bishop thinks that this is a mistake because it should be left unanalyzed. Okay, it is a primitive rule. And, well, trying to dig any deeper is a mistake. And as I said, mathematics is unformalizable for Bishop. In fact, mathematics is not formalizable for him because mathematics is common sense. This is one of Bishop's most striking and strong claims that he makes in his philosophical writings. And one might wonder what exactly he means by common sense. Well, this certainly has to do with the fact that our mathematics depends on our good judgment, right? So doing mathematics is in part dependent on our exercise of judgment, because we have to use our judgment to decide whether a certain rule is effective or whether some alleged proof is indeed a proof. So mathematics is not formalizable because you cannot formalize common sense, according to Bishop. So this is also why, according to Bishop, the so-called Brouwer-Haiding-Kolmogorov explanation of the intuitionistic logic constants, it's not enough to specify the meaning to give meaning to a certain formalism or mathematics. For that, you also need the common sense to fill some gaps. All right. So another principle that is used by Bishop, it's one of these four basic principles. The second being, do not ask whether a statement is true until you know what it means. And of course, meaning here has to do with the Brouwer-Haiding-Kolmogorov explanation, and also known as the BHK interpretation, sometimes known as explanation. Now, this interpretation or explanation tells us what is a proof of a certain proposition, right? For example, a proof of a conjunction, A and B, is a proof of A and a proof of B, and so on for each one of the logical constants. According to Bishop, a proof is any completely convincing argument, and of course, for that you also need common sense to make sense of the fact that the proof is completely convincing to you. And the last principle is also very important. It says that meaningful distinctions deserve to be maintained. And this is a principle that Bishop uses in order to criticize the classical mathematicians. All right, so Bishop is going to say that definitions are never free of ambiguity, because you can never put down exactly into words what all the possible ramifications of your definition are. All right. So there is always an opportunity for you to revise your definition. So I'm going to move forwards. Now it is time finally for our development of Bishop's views. So why a further development is needed anyway? Well, that is mainly for two reasons. That is, remember that Frege taught us that we should never accept that a concept is well-defined unless we have a clear criterion of identity for the objects that fall under that concept. And in fact, this can even be stressed by borrowing Quine's slogan that, no entity without identity. So what is a criterion of identity for constructions? Well, this is something that Bishop has never discussed. And because he has never done it, well, it looks like it is up to us philosophers to do so. So my basic claim is that identity has to respect computational meaning. And how do we make sense of this? Well, first of all, we are going to we're going to focus on the integers, which we are going to display in the unary system. Of course, not every numeric construction has the one or successive forms. For example, S1 plus 1 and 1 plus S1, they do not have these forms, right? But when fully calculated, they do lead to a value that has the one or successive form. All right. Now, a value is also a construction. It is a trivial method. Constructions can be described as methods for arriving at objects. And a value is a trivial method that starts with it and leaving it at that. All right. So, in practice, of course, we use decimal notation and not the unary one. So we are going to introduce abbreviations by defining, for example, 2 as S1 and 3 as S2 and so on, right? Calculation, remember, is the unfolding of definitions. And this idea, in fact, has a very strong mathematical philosophical pedigree in the literature. Here are some examples, right? You start, for example, this can be even traced back as far as Husserl's logical investigations, but it also in Klein and Curry Weiss, Martin Löf, and Clev. So here is the idea. All right. So I'm going to use this notation of this maps to mean that an effective rule allows us to reduce the construction M into N. Okay. So our definition of the integers, the so to speak canonical integers, the values of the integers, can be described in such a way. So 1 maps to 1, and M, if M maps to N, then, well, S of M maps to S of N, right? So Bishop does not use this notation, maps to. However, I think it is preferable because Bishop's triple bar suggests that this is a symmetric relation, which it is not. Okay, so we can also, of course, introduce a recursive scheme for functions in the usual way, and this is how we obtain, for example, addition, right? And now we can. It is clear, to see that S1 plus 1 and 1 plus S1, they should not be identical constructions because their chains of definitional reduction are not the same, all right? But of course, this is not a criterion of identity, right? But again, this gives a hint to what kind of account we should adopt. So clearly, sameness of value cannot be our criterion of identity because otherwise, this would not be computation sensitive, right? So we have to respect the computational meaning of constructions. So I want to examine 2 possible accounts. First, a naive one, and then a contextual one, which is where we are going to borrow Frege's ideas, all right? I'm going to propose and reject the naive accounts as follows. So the naive account is goes as this. Well, constructions are defined by the effective rules, right? So why not identify all constructions defined by the same effective rules? The problem with this account, however, is this. So let's now consider the booleans, true and false. So let's define true as the trivial method, true, and false as the another trivial method. Well, they seem to have the very same definition, right? How do we know that they're not the same? So in fact, they could be the same. We cannot even distinguish them from the number one, right? So it is a certain kind of reminiscent of the Caesar problem in this context of constructions. So how do we get out of this situation? Well, it seems that, in fact, the way that they can be distinguished from each other is, to distinguish them, you have to also consider other operations, such as, for example, Boolean negation, Boolean conjunction, and so on, and their behavior with this operation. So, for example, after we introduce Boolean negation, you can see that not true maps to false and not false maps to true. So this suffices to distinguish the canonical Booleans, true and false, from one another, from the number one, and the negation from the successor operation, if true is not the same construction as false. But how can we be sure of that? Well, maybe they could be the same construction, as far as we know, right? But if we keep adding some Boolean operations, it seems that we are able to then distinguish between these. So, for example, and here clearly computes differently on true and false, all right? So the takeaway here is that constructions can be indistinguishable at some point in time and then become different after we introduce an effective rule. So definitions, they never have the last word on how the constructions are computed. And this is exactly what we saw in Bishop, right? We can revise definitions. So my proposal here, and this is the contextual account, all right, is that we cannot specify the computational meaning of a construction just by looking at the effective rules prescribed with its definition. It has to be determined in the context of all the effective rules about it. So drawing inspiration from Frege, we are going to state the following. We must never investigate the computational meaning of a construction in isolation, but only in the context of other constructions that are related to it. Okay, but how do we actually follow this version of the context principle? Well, here is how I think we could proceed. First, we have to distinguish between two different classes of constructions, the atomic ones and the compound ones. Atomic constructions, they are the building bricks of everything. So they do not have any parts. They're constructions like 1, 2, true, false, and so on. Compound constructions, as the name suggests, they are made of other parts. So examples are S1, SS1, N plus M, N times M, and so on, right? So for atomic constructions, it seems that their computation of meaning can be determined just by all the effective rules in which they occur, where we define occurrence in a very intuitive way. So, of course, here we are going to leave the notion of effective rule as primitive, and we are also going to leave its conditions for sameness, just as explained. So it has to be something that mathematicians should be able to judge by themselves using, borrowing from their good judgment. Now, what about compound constructions? Well, for these, it seems, again, we can draw inspiration for Frege, now borrowing from the principle of compositionality. We must determine the computational meaning of a construction by means of the computational meaning of each of its construction components. And ultimately, we can reduce this case to that of atomic constructions. I'm not going to bore you with the details, especially because of time constraints. Now, finally, to conclude, I would like to very briefly consider a few objections to these developments. So, first of all, a disclaimer. So I do not claim that Bishop himself would accept my development of these ideas, of his ideas. All right. In fact, I'm not even sure he would be interested in such an approach because of his primarily mathematical interests. Right. So here's an objection. Let's say that we introduce the Sheffer stroke alongside negation and conjunction. Right. As we all know, the Sheffer stroke is the dual of conjunction. Right. So after the introduction of the Sheffer stroke, it seems that true and false now become indistinguishable again. Right. Because there is no way to distinguish from the way they compute. So how do we deal with this problem? Well, one way to approach this would be to, you could add another Boolean operation, right? But ultimately, at the end of the day, all Boolean operations, they're all instances of a case scheme that is the counterpart of the recursive scheme that we consider for the positive integers or natural numbers, right? So in this case here, we have a kind of operation that computes differently on a true and false, right? Because it projects the first, or rather, the second argument for the true, and the third argument for the false. And of course, the second and third arguments, they cannot be the same. All right, so this is how I think we are able to distinguish between the true and false as constructions. Now, finally, to wrap this up, I want to consider the question of how we may recover Bishop's constructivism, because all of this has been very abstract and not really related to how constructive mathematics in Bishop style is practiced. Now, to do that, I think one very plausible way would be to borrow the many explanations that Per Martin-Löf has proposed for his constructive type theory. So what I'm in fact proposing here is that constructions are untyped objects, and according to their computational behavior, we may then attach types to them, and by doing so, we can then give meaning to them using a generalization of the BHK interpretation, which is known as the many explanations. All right. Originally, there was also a third part of this talk, which I omitted here, but I would very briefly mention before I conclude, because if you would like to ask questions about it, maybe some of you have noticed that, this kind of approach that I am sketching here seems to have a lot to do with structuralism. And indeed, I am advocating a form of the structuralism for constructions. However, it is a very specific kind of structuralism. I unfortunately do not have time to enter into detail, but I thank you for your attention.
Você está mutado.
Sorry, thank you, Bruno. I was thanking Bruno for the talk. Thank you again for the talk. Let me see if we have questions. Mm-hmm. I can see we have questions in the chat. Okay, let me show it. The question is, how would the underdetermination of true and false occur with the introduction of the Sheffer bar?
Mm-hmm. All right. So thanks for the question. That's a very interesting one. So, as I mentioned, according to the naive account, we understand a construction, but we identify a construction by means of the effective rules that define it, right? So for the true and false, this would mean that because they're both trivial methods, we are not able to distinguish between them, right? We would in fact also have this problem for the number one. Now, and then the proposal was that, well, we can keep adding some operations that compute differently on true and false. The negation, the introduction of negation kind of helped the situation because we could then distinguish between, well, at least the Booleans true and false and the number one, and negation and the successor function. Because, well, if true is not false, then we have a operation that computes differently on the true and maps true to false and false to true, right? So it cannot be the successor function. Then we introduce conjunction, right? So conjunction was very helpful in this, in this attempt, because then we were able to distinguish between true and false, just because, well, clearly conjunction computes differently on true, right? It maps true and true to true, but something and false to false, right? But the problem, however, is that after we introduce the Sheffer stroke, which is the dual to conjunction, then it becomes unclear how to distinguish between them, because we are going to have a dual operation on which does not exactly emphasize the distinction in computational behavior between the true and false. So after we introduce this operation, well, we would be again unable to distinguish between them, just because, again, we wouldn't be able to know what is conjunction and what is the Sheffer stroke, just because we wouldn't be able to tell what is true and what is false, right? So I am not sure if that helps, but I hope it does.
Okay, thank you. We have other questions in the room. Rodrigo wants to make a question. His question is, he makes an observation first. Thank you very much for your presentation. I was not familiar with Bishop's views. Can you elaborate a little on his hostility, so to speak, towards formalization?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah. So a Bishop was, very much a follower of Brouwer. Brouwer was very much against formalization because, well, he thought that mathematics, and by mathematics, he actually meant intuitionistic mathematics, is essentially a language-less activity of the mind, right? And if it's an activity of the mind, then it's not something that you can put into words, and thus you cannot fully formalize it. Bishop was, not an advocate of intuitionistic mathematics in Brouwer's sense, although in a recent paper of mine, the one that I mentioned that just appeared in Filosofia Mathematica, I do argue that Bishop can be understood as an intuitionist in a different sense. However, Bishop does borrow this aspect of Brouwer views, in that for him, mathematics cannot really be formalized. Why not? Well, because according to him, first of all, the essence of constructive mathematics has to do with the notion of an effective rule, right? That the notion of an effective rule has to be primitive, right? We cannot really define it. If we can be able to, for example, rule out a putative rule from being a constructive rule. So, for example, you show Bishop, oh, this is a rule. Do you think this is a constructive rule? And if he's can tell you for sure, oh no, this cannot be a constructive rule. If he's able to do this, to describe what is not a rule of construction in advance, then there is going to be a problem at the fundamental level of his constructivism. Because, as I mentioned before, Bishop wants to have a form of constructivism which is consistent with classical mathematics. And part of the reason why Bishop's constructive mathematics is consistent with classical mathematics is that he's not able to reject the law of square middle. But why not? Well, that's because he cannot rule out the possibility that there might be some oracle construction, so to speak, that for any proposition outputs, tells you whether this is provable or not provable. So even these kind of constructions may not be ruled out. Otherwise, we would then validate the negation of the law of square middle. And this definitely is not something that Bishop would like to do. So yes, the Bishop's is very much against formalization. He was a follower of Brouwer. And another thing that I should mention before I conclude this reply is that Bishop thought that he was an even closer follower of Brouwer than Heyting himself. And that is because Heyting and the other intuitionists of his time, they were mostly interested in the study of intuitionistic formal systems, like theories of choice sequences and Kleene and so on, and Tolstra, Kreisel, and all of these people. They were very much interested in intuitionistic formal analysis, and Bishop thought that all of these people, they were, in his words, operating in a vacuum. So I hope that helps.
Okay. Gregory also wants to make a question. The question is, does Bishop's reject church thesis? And he continues, does Bishop's, in your opinion, anticipate Martin Love, or are you using Martin Love to try to interpret it and vindicate some of Bishop's ideas?
So yes, Bishop definitely does not accept Church's thesis. Yes, in fact, Martin Love is a follower of Bishop's brand of constructivism. And one of the very first papers on constructive type theory, a paper published in 1975, the paper in which Per Martin Love published the consistent version of, well, at least as far as we know, consistent version of constructive type theory. He claims in the very first paragraph of the paper that this theory is intended to be used as a tool to formalize or to aim at a full-scale formalization of constructive mathematics as done in Bishop's book. So yes, Martin Love's constructivism is inspired by Bishop, and it has Bishop constructivism as its target. There are many differences, though. For example, I believe that for Bishop, constructions are intrinsically untyped, while Martin Love would say otherwise. In other words, there's a distinction between typing in church and curry style. Church style means that types their properties of expressions, just like a type has an expression has a type, just like when you're born, your DNA identifies you, or your iris pattern, or your fingerprints. And a curry style typing says that expressions, they do have types, but this is not an intrinsic property. This is a property that can be assigned later on. Just like, when you, after you grow a little bit older, you get an ID or passports or driver's license or anything like this. So yes. So there are differences between Martin-Lef and Bishop. But yes, now replying to the last part of the question, I am indeed vindicating some of Bishop's ideas, borrowing from Martin-Lef, which is kind of anachronistic in this sense, because this is how I'm trying to make sense of Bishop's views. But again, this is a reconstruction of his views, and I'm not really intending to be faithful to the kind of philosophy that he had in mind. What I'm trying to do is more like trying to develop his views to see what are the ultimate consequences of his views, whether or not he would accept them.
Okay, thank you. I also have a question I'd like to ask. I want to share my opinion. I want to share what I've learned concerning this topic, constructivism or constructivism in mathematics. I have always seen constructivism in mathematics as a theory or as a philosophical perspective in which anything is allowed to be a number. Maybe this is a prejudice I have. Maybe this has something to do with Benacerraf's influence on philosophy of mathematics. So I want to know how Bishop's view, how different is Bishop's view from this perspective of constructivism? Maybe this constructivism I've just described is just a branch of constructivism. It's just a branch of this constructivism. So yeah, I want to know how could.
No, please go on. Yeah, sorry.
So how different is this characterization, this constructivism I have just described from Bishop's, this constructivism using notions of computation? How are they different?
I see. Before I answer that, though, I would like to ask you if you could elaborate on this kind of constructivism that you mentioned. Anything is allowed to be a number. So,
for example, if it's a view in which if a certain object or a certain construction, if you want, if it meets certain requirements, it's a number. For example, if it satisfies Peano's axioms, for example, it's a number.
Oh, I see. Okay, gotcha. So it's some kind of, in a sense, structuralist accounts, right? So it doesn't really matter what the object is, as long as it satisfies some constraints, and it may count as a number or certain construction. All right. I guess maybe I can take this as an opportunity to also build on how these views they are compatible with structuralism, because you also mentioned Benacerraf, right? And I think this is a very important problem that I think that some constructivists also fall victim of. In particular, in another recent paper of mine that was recently published, I think just last year in History and Philosophy of Logic, I claimed that Brouwer falls victim of Ben Asraf's problem of, dilemma of identification. And so, yes, how do we make sense of these views, these accounts, this account that I advocated as some sort of constructive structuralism, right? Because the idea here is clearly that, there is a certain structure, and constructions, they are identified in terms of a structure, except that here the structure is not really what we expect from most usual versions of structuralism. For example, for natural numbers, we have the natural number structure, and we say that natural numbers, they are just positions, right, in that structure. So this form of structuralism does not seem to be very compatible with mine. So rather than viewing numbers, or more generally constructions, as positions in a structure, I would like to see them in terms of relations that they occupy in a certain structure, all right? And the structure being the totality of all the effective rules. So the version of the version of structuralism that we would then obtain here is a structuralism and the so-called anti-RAM version, right? So that we have certain theses, for example, the ontological dependency thesis, which means that constructions, they would be dependent on the structure. Without the structures, without the structure, they do not have an existence on their own, right? So yes, indeed, there is some resemblance with these accounts that you emphasize, and namely, anything's allowed to be a construction as long as you do fulfill some requirements. In this case, the requirements being having a certain computational meaning, right? And yes, there is a form of structuralism. However, I want to emphasize that the structures, they are not types, unlike most version of structuralism. In the community, in the constructive community, one of the most prominent versions of structuralism that has been advocated in recent times is a form of structuralism that involves homotopy type theory, a structuralism that has been advocated, for example, by Aldi in one of his papers in Filosofia Mathematica, that identifies isomorphic structures, right? Isomorphics in a technical sense. However, here, our structures, and in my account, they are not types, because, again, constructions, they are intrinsically untyped, and the structure has to be the totality of all construction rules of construction.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. Let's proceed to the next talk. I will remove Bruno.
And thank you again for the invite and all the questions.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's proceed to the next talk. The last speaker is Professor Rodrigo Sabadin. Rodrigo Sabadin has a PhD in philosophy from the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul. He's interested in the history of logic and analytical philosophy. focusing on the works of Bertrand Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein. The title of his presentation is Infinity and the Ontology of Logicism in Principia Mathematica. Thank you very much for having accepted to talk about your work in this colloquium, Professor. As usual, you have a total time of 40 minutes to finish your presentation. You may start now.
Okay. Can you? Thanks. I was going to ask about the slides. Thank you very much. Just a quick observation before beginning. I would add now to be a little more specific on my topic, the subtitle "Individuals in the Status of the Axiom of Infinity" in the first edition of Principia. That makes that makes a little more clear what my topic will be. Before starting, I would also like to thank the organizers of this colloquium for the invitation to give this talk, and of course for organizing the event. I would like to thank especially Professor Alessandro Duarte, who contacted me with this kind invitation. Well, since English is not my first language, I will excuse myself for following closly the slides that I have, this PowerPoint that I have prepared. So, getting into business, I wanted to discuss some issues concerning the status of the axiom of infinity according to the first edition of Principia Mathematica. And according also to some important texts that Russell wrote and or published around the time of the publication and production of the first edition. So roughly from 1910 to 1912 are the texts that I'm gonna say some things about in this talk. In terms of more specific goals, I want to make a case that there is a tension in these texts that suggests an ambivalent attitude on Russell's part concerning the status of the axiom of infinity. Making this a little more clear, I want to point out that some things kind of don't add up when we pay close attention to some crucial passages of Principia and some of Russell's technical papers that he produced during the publication and production of the first edition of Principia. But in more general terms, my aim is the modest one of kind of suggesting an agenda of issues for further inquiry and discussion. Hopefully, I'll get some degree of success, at least in this last regard. So, my guiding question will be the following. Does Principia simply rules out the view that the so-called axiom of infinity may be a logical truth? Or more precisely, I'm interested in the question, is Principia committed to the view that the axiom of infinity is an empirical / contingent hypothesis, or does he leave it open, the possibility that the so-called axiom of infinity may turn out to be a logical truth? I put a little asterisk here in the term hypothesis, because that is precisely what the axiom of infinity is for Principia. It is not a proper axiom of the formal system, but it is a defined formula that appears as an antecedent in some proven theorems. Much like the axiom, Zermelo's axiom of choice, which is in Principia's version is called the multiplicative axiom, is not a proper axiom of the formal system. This is something that is important to get out of the way and be clear from the outset, since many interpretive issues, non-issues really, are raised when we don't pay attention to the fact that it's not the so-called axiom of infinity is not a proper axiom of Principia's formal system. So bear in mind, my question is whether Principia actually commits itself to the view that the so-called axiom is not a logical truth, or whether there is space for the claim that the work leaves it open the possibility that it may turn out to be a logical truth. So that is my guiding, my background problem here that I want to investigate. So my main task will be to establish that Principia itself and Russell's published tests do not provide an unequivocal answer to this question. What I intend to establish is that there is room for serious disagreement over this issue, given not only in a sense lack of textual evidence, but most importantly conflicting textual evidence that point to conflicting answers to this issue. For convenience and clarity of exposition, I will introduce a distinction, a terminological distinction that is not current in the secondary literature, but I think it will be a useful distinction between what I will call strict and broad interpretations of the status of the axiom of infinity. What this distinction amounts is, well, to put it succinctly, the following. The strict interpretation is the general view that, according to which Principia is committed to the view that the axiom of infinity is not a logical truth, and thus that according to Principia there can be no logical proof or a priori reason for accepting the axiom of infinity. In contrast, on the other hand, what I call the broad interpretation is the view that Principia leaves the status of the axiom of infinity as an open question. That is, Principia is not committed to the view that the axiom of infinity is not a logical truth, and two, Principia does not reject the possibility of a proof or a priori reason for accepting the axiom of infinity. So, in a sense, we can say that the broad interpretation is somewhat weaker than the strict interpretation, because according to the strict interpretation, Principia does have an answer to the question of the status of the axiom of infinity, while according to a broad interpretation, Principia is, so to say, agnostic concerning the status of the axiom of infinity. So, it is practically a non-issue in secondary literature that the strict position is the one presented in Principia. Part of the reason for this is that some of Russell's later texts somewhat, I think, unequivocally support the strict interpretation. Perhaps the most important, most famous example of this is Introduction to Mathematical Philosophy, where we find Russell stating, for instance, I will not read the whole quote, but only the underlined part here. Russell asserts, for instance, quote, "Some of the possible worlds are finite, some are infinite, and we have no means of knowing to which of these two kinds of our actual world belongs. The axiom of infinity will be true in some possible worlds and false in others. Whether it is true or false in this world, we cannot tell." So this is I take this to be a clear-cut statement of the strict view, that is simply stating the axiom of infinity is not a truth of logic. It can be false in some possible worlds. It is false in some possible worlds. It is true in others. And furthermore, this is an even stronger claim. We cannot even know whether it is or it is not true in the actual world. There are other texts where this view is either suggested or explicitly put forward by Russell. One important example, I think, is the second edition, the introduction to the second edition of Principia, where Russell explicitly identifies individuals with particulars, which is, as we'll see furthermore, is something that is certainly not done explicitly, and I think cannot be the correct reading in the first edition of Principia. But we'll get there. We'll get there down the road. So recently, despite the fact that the strict view is almost unanimous in the secondary literature, recently it was called into question by Gregory Landini, who argues that Principia implicitly commits itself to the following thesis, which is, I'm quoting here for Landini's latest book, Repairing Bertrand Russell's 1913 Theory of Knowledge, which, if I'm not mistaken, came out in 2022, where Landini claims that Principia is implicitly committed to the following view. Quote, that if there are infinitely many universals in the lowest simple type of Principia's type structure, then it is a logical necessity that there are infinitely many natural numbers in every relative type. I put a little asterisk here just to make something clear that it's a view that I share with Landini, which is that the infinity of natural numbers, according to Principia's logicism, is not part of pure mathematics, and the question of whether there are not infinitely many natural numbers can be dissociated from the logicist project as Whitehead and Russell understood the nature of this enterprise. But I'll not enter into this issue here. I just want to make it clear that as Landini does, that this is not in question here. The success of Principia's logicism is not, I think, at least, and I know Gregory does so as well, is not in any way tied up to the question of whether the axiom of infinity is or is not a logical truth. We can have a coherent conception of Russellian or Russellian Whiteheadian logicism without a definitive answer to this question. But it is a question that I want to address here. So Landini puts the strict interpretation into question by putting forward this view that if there are, according to his interpretation of Principia, which in broad outlines I share, that if we accept that there are infinitely many universals in the lowest simple type of Principia's type structure, it will be a logical necessity that there are infinitely many natural numbers in every relative type. I think Landini's general point is actually irreproachable. I take it, I take it that this broad interpretation can be supported by four interpretative theses or claims that find, I think, at least substantial textual support. The claims in question, I think, will be the following. First, that according to Principia, the totality of genuine entities is the totality of individuals, or to put it more bluntly and clearly, that according to Principia, only individual variables are genuine, only individuals are genuine entities, and the only genuine variables are individual variables. So, I don't want to enter into details of this because it would be a long and hard discussion to fit within our time. But this, what I take this to mean is that there is no such thing as an ontology of so-called propositional functions assumed in Principia Mathematica. The ontology of Principia is an ontology of individuals. We'll see that one important issue will be, well, what these are. But that I take to answer this question, we have claim 2, which will be that according to Principia, individuals are subdivided into 2 exhaustive and mutually exclusive categories, which will be universals and particulars. So Principia, claim 1, Principia commits itself to an ontology of individuals, and this ontology of individuals subdivides into 2 mutually exclusive and exhaustive categories, which are universals and particulars. Claim 3, and according to Principia, the totality of individuals at the lowest level of the hierarchy of types is made up of both universals and particulars. That is, that the lowest in Principia's lowest simple type, its genuine variables range both over particulars and universals. That is, differently from what Russell asserts in the introduction to the second edition, in the first edition of Principia, the individual variables have as their range both particulars and universal, or at least I think this is a view that can be extracted not only from some of Russell's other texts from the period of the first edition, but from the introduction to the first edition as well. I think at least this is implied by a lot of things that Russell says there. Although it must be observed that in the introduction to the first edition, neither the word at least as far as I know, neither the word particular or universal appear in the discussion of the Principia's theory notion of distinction of types. Finally, the fourth claim, which I think finds also extensive textual support, is the view that Principia commits itself to the view that the existence of universals is a question of a logical character, or that the existence of universals is a logical matters. In other words, that, as Landini puts it, according to Russellian logicism and according to Principia, universals exist of logical necessity. So I take it that these four claims support the conclusion reached by Landini, and I also think that these four claims find in with somewhat different degrees, but at the end of the day, they find substantive textual support in both in Principia itself, as well in other texts of Russell published and are produced in the same period of the first edition of Principia. Assuming these claims to be correct, by the way, which I think is the case, I agree with this interpretative claims or thesis. I think we must conclude that that Principia cannot be committed to the view that the axiom of infinity is not a logical truth. On the contrary, Principia is committed to the view that it may be a logical necessity. However, there are statements made in the text of Principia that seem to force, or at least strongly to suggest, the strict interpretation of the status of the axiom of infinity. Passages such as the following, which we find in volumes 2 and 3 of Principia. For instance, in volume 2, we find the claim that it seems plain that there is nothing in logic to necessitate its truth or falsehood, and that it can only be legitimately believed or disbelieved on empirical grounds. This, I take strongly suggests what I'm calling here a strict reading of the status of the axiom of infinity. Also, in volume 3, we find a claim like the following. When the axiom of infinity is required, it is always explicitly stated in the hypothesis, so that our propositions, as enunciated, are true even if the axiom of infinity is false. There is another passage here that if time allows, I can come back later. But I think this passages, such as the one quoted from volume 2 and the other from volume 3, suggest that there is an indication that Principia is at least ambivalent towards the status of the axiom of infinity, although the passage from volume 3 in particular explicitly considers the possibility that the axiom of infinity is false, which suggests that it is being taken here that it cannot be, or it is not, a logical truth. But so, given that we have this interpretive thesis that, or claims that I think support the conclusion that the broad interpretation is correct, but on the other hand, we have these passages which also corroborate the strict interpretation. Well, where do we go from here? I think one way to approach this impasse is to pay close attention to what Principia and other texts of Russell say about the nature of so-called individuals. In particular, to determine whether the use of this notion in Principia is coherent with or consistent with Russell's claims outside of the text of Principia about the nature of these entities. We may also pay close attention to what Russell says about the axiom of infinity in other texts produced around the publication of Principia's first edition, in order to search for a little more, let's say, a little more light on the issue. So, why we need to do that also because Principia tells us very little about the nature of the so-called individuals. For instance, what we find is the following very sort of indeterminate explanation of the notion, which is this. Quote, we may explain an individual as something which exists on its own account. There is a similar passage which appears in the paper from 1908 of Russell, Mathematical Logic as Based on the Theory of Types, where Russell simply characterizes individuals as entities that are destitute of complexity. That is, Russell defines individuals as simple entities. What Principia also explains the notion of individuals as such objects that will be constituents of propositions or functions, will be genuine constituents in the sense they do not disappear on analysis, as for example classes do, or phrases of the form this, so, and so. Here, what Russell is doing is characterizing individuals in opposition to what he calls logical constructions. That is, pseudo entities like classes, which in Principia are contextual, are eliminated in terms of contextual definitions, which eliminate all class expressions from the language via the eliminatory device from Sector 20 of Principia. Which became known in the literature as the so-called no-class theory of classes. So, given this somewhat poor explanation, both of the notion of individual and the fact that we find conflicting textual evidence regarding the status of the axiom of infinity, we could look for an answer in Russell's technical texts that were produced during the publication and production of the first edition. Three important texts, I think, are crucial here, which are the philosophical importance of mathematical logic from 1911, analytic realism from 1911, and on the axioms of the infinite and the transfinite, also from 1911, which are three lectures that Russell gave on France shortly after the publication of the first volume of Principia. My focus here will be on the third of these because this is the one that raises the most pressing and important, I think, interpretative issues. What we find there in this paper is, again, several claims that I think suggest the strict interpretation against the four interpretive claims that I think can be used to support Landini's broad interpretation. We find, for instance, in that paper, which basically it aims at explaining to a broad audience not familiar with the technical intricacies of Principia, why the work requires the axiom of infinity and what Russell calls the multiplicative axiom, or the axiom of choice, in order to prove central results of the theory of infinite cardinal numbers. And in that text, we find an explanation given by Russell of a fundamental difference that there is between these two hypotheses, or so-called axioms, which is the following. Quote from the paper Axioms of the Infinite and the Transfinite: there is a difference between the axiom of infinity and the multiplicative axiom, which is important from the vantage point of the theory of knowledge. The multiplicative axiom has the form and nature of the axioms of logic, for can there be no empirical demonstration of its truth. The considerations which bear on the truth or falsehood of the multiplicative axiom are considerations of logic, a priori considerations. The axiom of infinity, on the other hand, is purely empirical. For any v, whether v is a finite or infinite cardinal, it is a priori possible that v is the number of the individuals in the universe. This passage raises very difficult interpretative problems. For, on the one hand, Russell asserts that there is a difference between the axiom of infinity and the multiplicative axiom, which is important from the vantage point of the theory of knowledge. This somewhat suggests that something that goes along with Landini's broad interpretation, which is that the difference between the two, from the perspective, difference in status between the two from the perspective of Principia's logicism, is merely epistemic. That is, that on the one hand, the axiom of infinity, much like the multiplicative axiom, may turn out to be a logical truth, albeit and this can be sound strange, but it is, I think, is something that in principle we cannot discard from a Russellian perspective, a logical truth that can only be discovered empirically or not at all. What will lead to such a discovery? Maybe some physical theory, for instance, that implies the existence of infinitely many particulars which instantiate an infinite totality of distinct universals. Well, universals being entities that exist of logical necessity will make the axiom of infinity a logical truth. Although the discovery of this would be via an empirical discovery, namely that there are infinitely many particulars that instantiate an infinity of infinitely many different universals. As this is something that, from a Russellian perspective, seems to be admissible, despite the fact that it may sound a little strange. But The issue is that also in the paper that I'm calling attention to here, we find Russell asserting that Russell asserting that the axiom of infinity is purely empirical, and that for any v, finite or infinite, it is possible a priori for v to be the number of individuals in the universe, which I think seems to strongly suggest the strict interpretation against the merely, so to say, interpretation which takes the difference between the multiplicative axiom and the axiom of infinity to be merely epistemic. Again, what we make of this? Well, we could again try to find in the paper a little more about about how the notion of an individual is being understood. Well, that actually makes the matters worse for you, particularly if we keep in mind the question of whether the category of individuals should include both particulars and universals. We find that the paper raises further interpretative questions precisely because of the way Russell introduces the notion of an individual there. When introducing the axiom of infinity, Russell states the following, quote, "The axiom of infinity is formulated as follows. If n is any cardinal number, there is a class consisting of n individuals." This is, of course, the formulation of the axiom of infinity, which is equivalent to the formulation given in Principia, which asserts that the null class is not a member of the set of cardinal numbers. The quote continues here. The word individual contrasts with class, function, proposition, etc. In other words, an individual is a being in the actual world, as opposed to the beings in the logical world. To expand on this notion, I would have to explain the theory of logical types, which I do not wish to do. The lacuna which follow from this omission will no doubt be noticed by my audience. End quote. Well, the omission is certainly noticeable. For one thing, because without such an explanation of the notion of how the notion of individual is being used, the claim that individuals are beings of the actual world as opposed to the beings in the logical world may be quite misleading. One could think, for instance, that universals are being beings of logic, according to Russell, that exist of logical necessity. Understanding the notion of beings of logic in that paper to include universals, we'll have to conclude that Russell is understanding the notion of individual to be synonymous with particulars, which is there is a contingent existence. Fortunately, the passage at least clears this misunderstanding up, because the contrast between the beings of logic and the beings of the actual world can be understood in terms of the opposition between genuine entities, that is, individuals, whatever they are, and logical constructions of or pseudo-entities such as classes and propositions, given that Russell explicitly contrasts individuals with functions and propositions, which I think, according to the Russellian logicism in this period, are pseudo-entities, or as Russell refers to them sometimes, as non-entities. But we can at least claim that universals, being genuine entities, that is, including being entities including among the individuals, they will not be part of the world of logic in this sense of being logical constructions, but they will be part of the world of logic, so to say, because universals, according to Russellian conception of universals, they exist of logical necessity. This is a point that is clearly noted in a very good paper by Kevin Clement from 2015, which is the constituents of the propositions of logic, which is a very good paper that addresses some of the issues that I'm trying to get a clear view here. In any case, I think that accepting the distinction in these terms does not directly resolve the central question about the inclusion of universals among individuals at the lowest level of the hierarchy of types. Given given the indeterminacy in the use of the notion of individual in Principia and texts such as that one from 1911. In other words, it is despite the fact that the notion of the universals are not being excluded here from the category of individuals, it is not clear enough that they must be included in the category of individuals. What we have is it's indirect evidence for this claim, which roughly appears which is roughly given by the fact that in the introduction to the first edition of Principia, Russell accepts what later become known as his multiple relation analysis of judgment, which I take it assumes a completely untyped category of individuals, which must include, in order for the theory to work and make sense, the notion of the individual must include both particulars and universals within the category of individuals. As I see it, it is precisely this distinction between the entities of the real world as opposed to the entities of logic that is unclear here, without a clear-cut explanation of how the nature of type distinctions is being understood by Russell, which precisely he omits in the 1911 paper. In any case, I think these brief considerations point to some I must say, rather unexciting conclusions, which is that first, both readings, strict and broad readings or interpretations, find textual support, but also face serious interpretive difficulties. I think this is the case, particularly given the fact that the four interpretative theses, which I think support the broad reading or interpretation, which is suggested and defended by Landini, that these claims find considerable textual support. This, in turn, I think suggests that the presence of a certain basic or fundamental tension within Principia and within certain central texts that were produced by Russell in the period of Principia's first edition, such as the paper on the axioms of the infinite and the transfinite from 1911. My suggestion would then be that for further investigating these issues, we'll have to look elsewhere. One possibility that is if my optimism is correct, is that maybe if we carefully revisit some of Russell's manuscripts that lead up to Principia, bearing these issues in mind, we may find clues to solve some of these puzzles. Paradox. Some of the manuscripts or unpublished works that I have in mind here are, for instance, manuscripts like the Paradox of the Liar from 1906, the manuscript on types from January 1907, the manuscript individuals from 1907, 1908. We don't know exactly the date of this manuscript, and the same is the case from the manuscript with the manuscript, the hierarchy of types, which we also don't know if it is from 1907 of early 1908. One important example, I don't want to get into I will not get into the details here because I don't think the time will allow. But one important example here will be the manuscript individuals, which provides evidence that Russell and Whitehead considered a more detailed explanation of their use of the notion of individual. And in particular, that manuscript shows that they even consider introducing the notion of individual as a primitive idea into the object language of Principia. And the paper, I think, also in general indicates that the somewhat indeterminate or neutral or agnostic use of the notion of individual in that text, in the both in the manuscript and in Principia itself, may very well be deliberate. I will not get into the details. I don't think time will allow me to do the justice to this text. But I think that in general, such manuscripts like that, the manuscript individuals, they suggest that Whitehead and Russell deliberately employed the notion of individual in a determinate or neutral way, leaving the question of the nature of individuals as an object of external or investigation that is something that falls out of the scope of mathematical logic but enters into the domain of what Russell called philosophical logic. But if this is the case, however, the comments on the status of the axiom of infinity that in the second and third volumes that suggest or strongly suggest the strict interpretation apparently violate this commitment to neutrality and so seem to remain without a satisfactory explanation. Given all this, a question that I think merits consideration is whether the number of conflicting passages with respect to the status of the axiom of infinity does not establish an ambivalence on Russell's part regarding the interpretation of distinctions of types, in particular with respect to the question of the nature of the entities that constitute the lowest level of Principia's hierarchy of types, that is, of the individuals. One thing I think we cannot discard is the possibility that Russell started having doubts about the treatment of types in the first edition as early as in 1911. Perhaps Russell was unsure about his multiple relation analysis of judgment, which at that point he did not attempt to fully develop, and which in turn raised doubts about his nominalistic treatment of functional variables in the first edition. However, I would like to make clear that I'm not defending these views here, but I think these are possibilities that are worth considering. My aim was to show that there is a puzzle to be solved, but as of yet, however, I think the solution is yet to be found. To conclude, I want to thank again the organizers of this colloquium, in particular Alessandro, who invited me to give this talk, and for the organizer and moderators for the invitation and the organization of the event. I would also like to take the occasion to thank Professor Gregory Landini for discussing many of these issues and texts that I address here in personal correspondence. Although, of course, any errors or mistakes here are my sole responsibility. So thanks for listening. I think you're muted, Rafael.
Very well. Very interesting talk, Professor Rodrigo. There are now 20 minutes left for debate. Do we have questions or comments?
I think Bruno left one. Oh no! It was a thing. He had to leave early, but I think he left. I think Gregory has a. If I'm seeing the chat correctly.
Okay.
Has a question.
Professor Gregory, Professor Landini has a question. 1 second, 1 moment. Let me read the question. Perhaps the question is, or the comment is, perhaps many seeming tensions are cleared up by distinguishing the infinite axiom from infinite axiom, etc., infinite axiom alpha. Russell's hope of nominalistic semantics, which lasts after he abandoned, I don't know what MRTJ means, but all the way to the 1925 second edition must be distinguished from Whitehead-Russell's intended realistic semantics, where universals are in every simple type of individuals.
I don't know if you can get my slides back up, because I actually have something prepared, because I knew this point would come up. I don't know if I can get them back up. So thank you, Gregory, for your question. So just let me find the passage. It's actually just let me get back to that. It is. Oh, sorry. So here, for instance, here we have that quite important passage from volume 2, where we have reason to think that it's the sole responsibility of Whitehead, right? Where we have the assertion that it may be the case that the number of individuals is inductive, that is finite, but the number of predicative functions of individuals is not inductive, that is infinite. And then, and after that, there is, I think, a passage that is open for debate. What does it mean? But I think we are on the same page that the first part of this passage suggests a semantic interpretation, which, as I understand, you attribute to Whitehead. There is very different from the one that Russell puts forward in the first introduction, in the introduction to the first edition, right? So this will be the Whitehead's semantic interpretation will be a realist semantics, where we have individuals in we have both particulars and universals in the lowest simple types as the range of the individual variables, and variables of higher types will range over universals. So that is what if we are on the same page, right? Yes. I think on Whitehead's part, things are much clearer than on Russell's part, if that is the view he put forward. I think if we divide the split up the authors and ask, well, what about the status of the axiom of infinity according to Russell and according to Whitehead? I think in the case of Whitehead, things are very much clear. I agree with you. I think you suggest this in your latest book, that Whitehead had a strong intuition. I think it is this way that you put it, right? That there must be infinitely many natural numbers, because there are infinitely many universals in lowest simple type. Correct me if I'm mistaken. So I think maybe according to Whitehead, the status of the axiom of infinity was more clear cut than the case of Russell. I think Russell had a much more ambivalent attitude, and I sincerely doubt into part of the reason I put together all of this is because in almost utter exasperation, I have a very hard time in fitting together all the moving parts when we come to Russell's texts. I have a sort of a hard time making his use of certain notions, in particular that of an individual, consistent with all that is said, for instance, in the first edition of Principia.
So let me just ask a few fundamental questions to see whether we agree or disagree. So in Principia, we have simple type ambiguity as opposed to relative type ambiguity. Relative type ambiguity concerns the no classes theory, and so that just disappears. But we have simple type ambiguity, which nowadays we characterize with individual variables having different simple type indices, like 0 or a 0 in brackets or what have you. Now, if you see Principia's formal language that way, now, of course, it's controversial because they characterize the formal language in simple type ambiguity. But if you see it in that way, then clearly there are individual variables in the object language which have different simple type indices. Then the question of intended semantics has to do with what do you do with ones that are above 0, so x with 0 in brackets. And of course, one Whitehead interpretation would be that there are universals in the range of those variables under a natural realist semantics. But Russell, on the other hand, as we both agree, I think, has a kind of nominalist semantics in mind. And when done in that way, then he is radically different than what Whitehead has in mind for these kinds of variables. So if we agree on the syntactic point, then the interesting question, when you say the axiom of infinity, we have to realize there are many different candidates. There's the axiom of infinity with x0 as opposed to axiom of infinity with x in brackets 0 and so on for individuals. Then there's the axiom of infinity with an alpha in there, which has to do with classes. So if on Russell's nominalistic semantic interpretation, if we start with the axiom of infinity x0, then he doesn't want that one to be a matter of pure logic. But on Whitehead's view, the axiom of infinity with x0 in brackets could well be a logical truth because it concerns that there might be infinitely many individuals in that simple type as where there's only finitely in the lower one. So I just wonder if you might agree that if you and I have various conversations in the future, we might be able to reduce some of these tensions simply by distinguishing different meanings of the axiom of infinity.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. One thing that must be clear here is that whenever we are talking about simple types, we must radically distinguish them from the relative types, which applies to classes and classes of classes and so on. I think that is certainly a way to reduce these tensions. Perhaps I could be clear on one thing. Just is that the main point that I think makes the Russell part confusing to me is that given his commitment to the multiple relation theory of judgment, which requires that the notion of individual as be completely untyped at the lowest in the lowest simple type. That is, there must be down in the hierarchy of types. We must have particulars and universals, and this should be in a completely untyped category, right? Well, given that, once we formulate the axiom of infinity in terms of 0 of or O, when we have the axiom of infinity asserting that at the lowest simple type we have Aleph null or infinitely many individuals, how could Russell have not realized that the axiom of infinity could be made true by the existence of infinitely many universals? that is something that is puzzling to me, and it is one of the things that I try to indicate that seems to make his use of the notion of individual somewhat inconsistent, because if we assume the multiple relation theory of judgment, and we assume that at the bottom we must have universals, then infinite x, the axiom of infinity formulated for the lowest simple type can be made true by the existence of universals. So what's up with the assertion that, well, there can be no logical reason at all for this is not a good passage because it appears in the preface to the second volume. But let us take, for instance, the assertion that the axiom of infinity is purely empirical. As I see it, this is at best a very poor choice of words on Russell's part when he says that it is purely empirical. Well, if the first edition is correct, then there is the possibility that it is not purely empirical if there are infinitely many universals. So I'll sort of return the question. Do you agree with that, putting the problem in these terms?
Yes. Well, the two of us have strong intuitions that there are infinitely many universals, and where by that we mean that universals and particulars do not have logical type distinction at the lowest level. Both are values of the individual variables of x0. We have strong intuitions that there are infinitely many universals in that simple type, because universals are creatures of intension, not creatures of extension. There might be infinitely many universals, but yet, since there are only finitely many particulars, there are only finitely many universals that are not co-exemplifying. And it looks like Russell is thinking of universals needing to be ones that are not co-exemplifying, and instead of thinking of the universals in intention. And now we need an error theory about why he was thinking of that in those ways. And my error theory would be there's a bit of confusion there on Russell's part, because he realizes that mathematics is extensional, and so the difference between universals in intention shouldn't be playing a role in the realm of mathematics, which is a realm of extension. But you and I think, Rodrigo, we agree that if there are infinitely many universals at the bottom, we're good to go, and that the extensional component of mathematics won't be getting in the way, even though it's extensionality that has to rule in mathematics. So I think that Russell perhaps was a little bit nervous about, or perhaps confused about that. He's right that mathematics is an extensional language, but infinitely many universals in intention in the lowest type could play a role just as well as infinitely many, concrete, if you will, particulars in the lowest type. So that's my best gloss of that. But I agree that issue is the best issue concerning tension. Issues concerning different, we can't add a typically ambiguous axiom of infinity, right? Because that would then immediately give an infinity in every simple type. So, but why couldn't we add as an axiom of infinity for x0? And Russell then, I think Whitehead conceded to Russell that we shouldn't do that, but it was only because of this issue of the intuition that the infinity of universals at the lowest type is not something that he felt could be made axiomatic. But I agree with you. It's this clash of intuition at this lowest level. Yes, I would. So I think we're really in agreement on that. I need an error theory. You don't need an error theory, but just have Russell being ambivalent about that situation. But my error theory is that he gets confused the issues of extensionality with the issue of the infinity of universals.
Thank you for the comments and the questions. I think we may have a little hope. I hadn't had time lately to do that, but I think maybe if we get back to some of the manuscripts with these issues, with these particular issues in mind, maybe something can turn out to at least show why why we find this confusion or inconsistency is a strong word, but I think we may find something there that can throw light on the issues. Just I don't know if I have time, but there is one particular passage that I found on the paper Paradox of the Liar, which I think is particularly interesting. I'm just gonna put it here because I think it is somewhat illuminating. Just let me find. I think I didn't. I'll send it to emails, but it's a passage in the email. It's a passage where Russell is considering what predicates, and by predicates I can only take him to mean qualities, can be eliminated. And it goes back and forth as well. At some point he goes, well, it seems that we can eradicate most predicates except some, such as good. Well, good is a universal from a Russellian perspective. So when he says predicate, that must be a universal. So, well, I don't want to go on and on, but I think may turn light in these issues.
Let me make a suggestion along those lines, but then there may be other questions. So, but very quickly, just it may be that Russell thought that at this lowest level, when we put, for example, not F, where we accept, F as a universal, not F is questionable as a distinct universal. See what I mean? And therefore, if we're nervous about that, or have like F or being F, or today is Wednesday, maybe you can be nervous about that. And if you're nervous about that sort of thing, then that would clash with the intuition that we know that there are infinitely many universals in intention.
Yeah, well, I think you should be nervous about that, because it's a very hard pill to swallow. That well, we have given the fact that we can indefinitely proceed a formula with a negation sign, we should accept that there are infinitely many things in the world. Infinity cannot come that easily. at least I think so. But well, I don't know how we are on time. But again, thank you very much for your comments and the questions. I'll send you the passage. I forgot to put it here, but I'll say I can send you by email.
Okay, thank you very much for the talk and the questions.
There is no question in comments.
There were no questions in the comments in the chat. Well, I want to thank the speakers and the people behind the organization of this event for making it possible. I want to thank Alessandro and André. We had a valuable exchange of views this morning. I hope everyone enjoyed the topics discussed. The second day of the NuLFiC Colloquium for Logic and Philosophy of Mathematics has come to its end. There are going to be 3 more presentations at the same time tomorrow. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Very fun.
Bye.
Thank you again for